You are listening to the Oqual cycle with Amjad Farouk. And now, Chapter 2, Political Waves. Not long ago, the American spaceship was comfortably cruising at a sky-high altitude as the 21st century rolled in over 2 decades ago. Even the distant stars appeared to be aligned for the then sole superpower to continue to call the shots in its quest to dominate the universe at large. Add to that the euphoria of American dream run amok to the nth degree. Many Americans even believed that unlike the British Empire upon which the sun never set, the American hegemony was rising with the sun and that America's best days were yet to come. To others, it seemed like a utopian era waiting on the horizon with the promise of making America's past look tame by comparison. Bluntly put, there was no limit to what the United States could and would not conquer, so as long it remained not only head and shoulders, but also chest and waist above other nations, even if that required dismantling any competitor who dared to challenge the American supremacy. It would simply continue to be the American way or the highway. However, with the new century having barely gotten its feet wet, the nation would be struck by the 9/11 attacks in 2001, and in a split second of horror, America's horoscope turned upside down. Quel dommage! What a pity! Alas, the 9/11 attacks did not fall out of the sky. Indeed, rather than merely relying on the stars to do the heavy lifting, the U.S. government would take matters into its own hands so as to guarantee America's destiny through turning the 9/11 attacks into a pretext so as to finish off the unsettled business. What followed next were a series of decades-long perpetual wars across the Middle East, propagandized in the name of democracy and freedom, but with the hidden objective of changing the world order so as to extend the branches of America's hegemonic tree farther than ever before. However, such a criminal and reckless grand plan that would kill and uproot millions of innocent lives would not only backfire but would also come back to haunt America for generations to come. Admittedly, more than 2 decades later, the embers of the wars waged in the aftermath of 9/11 continue to rage to this day. While the 9/11 wars kept seething overseas, America continued to decay at home, from soaring public debts through shrinking middle class to faltering infrastructure. The continued failure of the U.S. government to address such shortcomings, coupled with the loss of public trust, ultimately morphed into a rage that led one half of America to elect Donald Trump to the nation's highest office in 2016. Yet, the other half of America continues to be petrified by the humiliating aspect of not only having had a con man run their country, but with him being the odds-on favorite to make a comeback and take the helm once more in 2024. Perhaps what this other half of America does not get is that Trump is not the cause of the status quo, but rather the effect and symptom of his predecessors having not only failed Americans, but also having sold America to the wealthy at the expense of the poor. If Trump's rise to power was a canary in the coal mine, then his ability to govern with an iron fist, with no regard for the rule of law, marked the beginning of the end of unraveling of America before his very own eyes. In the context of Oqual cycle, Trump's inauguration to the nation's highest office in 2017 could not have been more fitting, or rather preordained. Exactly 84 years earlier, in 1933, Adolf Hitler came to power in what came to be known as Nazi Germany. Like Trump, Hitler also vowed to make Germany great again. Not only did Hitler terribly fail, but he also left an indelible stain on humanity. Like the Nazi madman, Trump is on an irreversible mission to hollow out what little remains of America's global prestige and leave behind a lasting impact of his bigotry for generations to come. On a brighter note, just as a more peaceful and prosperous Germany emerged from the clutches of Hitler, a similar fate also awaits America, albeit in the shadow of China that is all but set to take up the mantle of global leadership over the next decade or so. Indeed, America is not the first hegemon to fall from grace, but rather it is merely following in the footsteps of its predecessors, whose hegemony for the most part lasted no more than a period of around 84 years. In the context of an Oqual cycle, the precipitous decay of the American hegemony over the past quarter of a century should be hardly surprising given that such a contrasting change in fortunes befalls every nation, hegemonic or not. However, in the case of hegemons, they face the dire prospect of having to pass on the baton of hegemony to one of their competitors, a fate that America is set to exercise as it prepares to relinquish its role to the new sheriff in town. Nevertheless, during the decade beginning with Annus Horribilis 2028 of the current Aquanium and ending with Annus Mirabilis 2039 of the next cycle, Americans on both sides of the political aisle will finally cluster together and put their differences aside so that America can once again rise from the ashes, yet in a triumph of free will over determinism. In order to appreciate the full gamut of political waves that seemingly oscillate in sync with the progression of an Oqual cycle, let us dissect our discussion further into the following sections. 2.1 Global Hegemony. 2.2 Global Politics. 2.3 Global Reset. Section 2.1 Global Hegemony. In a way that human lifespan runs about 84 years on average, it seems that this also holds true for the hegemon's shelf life, the length of time over which a global power exercises absolute hegemony or dominance over other nations. That should be hardly surprising in that both lifespans are under the thumb of Oqual cycle, and as such they share features beyond just their lengths. Just as human life is occasionally cut short or extends well beyond the average length, so does the hegemony of a global power. The age of neither is set in stone, but nevertheless it gyrates around 84 years. In a manner that humans typically reach their overall peak at the age of 42, beyond which their star begins to dim and then eventually bows out at around 84, the global dominance of a power also appears to reach a crescendo over the first 42 years before unwinding over the following 42 years as it enters the wilderness, but before passing the torch onto a newly crowned hegemon. Not only are hegemons mortal with an average lifespan of 84 years, but their rise and fall also appears to occur in parallel with the waxing and waning of human civilization over the course of an Oqual cycle in what is dubbed the hegemony aqua cycle. Nevertheless, due to a combination of atypical socio-political forces at play, coupled with right choices made, some global powers may be able to extend their lifespan and exert their hegemony across 2 consecutive rounds of an Oqual cycle, as was the case for the British Empire over much of the combined course of the 5th, 1787 to 1870, and 6th, 1871 to 1954 Aquania. Notably, the hegemon's global dominance over rival powers typically peaks at around the midpoint of an Oqual cycle before it becomes embroiled in excesses and imbalances that subsequently plant its downfall from grace. For example, America's hegemony peaked just prior to the outbreak of 9/11 wars, almost in parallel with the onset of the second half, 1997 to 2038, of the current and 7th Aquanium, 1955 to 2038. Indeed, America was widely believed to be the sole superpower during much of the 1990s after the apoptosis of its closest rival, the Soviet Union, in 1991. However, such exorbitant hubris of being the sole superpower was exactly what led the capitalist cabal to dig the nation's grave through waging decades-long and self-destructive 9/11 wars. That America's precipitous fall from grace would begin almost in sync with the onset of such an asinine self-defeating pursuit to the delight of his rivals should therefore be hardly surprising. In fact, barely a decade later, America's sole superpowerness would be challenged by the rapid rise of China just as the teenies kicked off. It should be noted that the hegemonic peak of a global power is not necessarily coincident with the peak of its imperial inertia. A global power may, for example, continue to bloat and add new colonies to its imperial crown well past its hegemonic peak, but it may no longer be the most powerful entity relative to its rivals, with one of them usually being the hegemon. What is the difference between a global power and imperial power? A global power exerts its geopolitical influence outside its comfort zone in far-flung regions, typically located on the other side of a large body of water rather than solely connected via land. A global power is therefore inherently an imperial power, but the converse may not necessarily be true. For example, prior to the birth of modern age in 1451, the Ottoman Empire and the Chinese Empire were two of the greatest imperial powers of their time, but neither was a global power in the sense that their sphere of geopolitical influence was largely restricted over a large body of contiguous landmass rather than stretching across vast oceans. In that sense, Portugal became the first true global power at the outset of modern age in that it was able to conquer oceans and colonize unfamiliar territories which no other nation had ever done before in the history of humanity. Simply put, Portugal was the first nation to break through the glass ceiling of global hegemony as it pioneered maritime navigation across vast oceans and paved the way for European colonization of regions outside the comfort zone of Afro-Eurasia centered around the Mediterranean Sea. What causes the rise and fall of hegemons? While previous works such as the 1987 book titled Long Cycles in World Politics by the Polish-American political scientist George Modelsky and the 2021 book titled Principles for Dealing with the Changing World Order by the American financier Ray Dalio lend deep insights into the rise and fall of great powers, such a change in political fortunes, however, appears to be synchronized with the waxing and waning of the broader human civilization over the course of Oqual cycle, implying that a similar set of forces are at play in triggering the rise and fall of hegemons as well as a human society as a whole, as discussed under section 1.2. In particular, the hegemon's rise and fall from grace over the course of Oqual cycle is marked by a cascade of 4 distinct steps, each of which occurs in tandem with the corresponding 21-year Uranian season as chronologically outlined below. 1. Spring. Hegemon rises to global dominance. Hegemon's rise to global dominance causes the standard of living at home to precipitously rise due to the fact that it controls the world's resources and therefore gets to have the first bite before letting others munch on leftovers and substandard products. Not only that, but it also turns into Mecca for immigrants as new riches attract people from unskilled workers to undertake dirty and low-paid jobs through highly skilled professionals to geniuses from all over the world. In particular, being in charge of the world's reserve currency implies that the hegemon simply prints his way to glory through luring top minds from across the globe to its shores at the expense of other nations having to grapple with not only a massive brand drain, but also having footed the bill for their education only to lose their best on a free transfer. One only has to look at how the fortunes of America bloated overnight in the aftermath of World War II, almost in parallel with the start of spring 1955 to 1975 of the current Aquanium, 1955 to 2038. For its part, Britain experienced such a virtue across much of both the 5th, 1787 to 1870, and the 6th, 1871 to 1954 Aquania. However, the increase in standard of living results in wages skyrocketing such that the cost of manufacturing goes through the roof at home, and it is only a matter of time before the hegemon loses his manufacturing competitiveness to other nations. 2. Summer. Hegemon loses manufacturing prowess. As manufacturing costs surge at home, the hegemon begins to heavily rely on imported goods and services, which is made all the more easier given that they are essentially free in that they are being paid for with worthless notes of junk paper due to monetary hegemony that comes with global dominance. The hegemon's national currency effectively serves as the world currency with a lion's share of global trade. In other words, the hegemon becomes a consumer nation on steroids as its populace begins to indulge in the fruits of others' labor without having to break its own sweat in stark violation of the unforgiving laws of nature. Against the backdrop of virtually free goods and services being imported from poorer nations, manufacturing jobs for the masses at home become increasingly few and far between, due in no small part to hegemon's big manufacturers having moved their headquarters overseas due to dirt cheap labor and taking the technological know-how with them. In particular, one of these poorer countries usually serves as a feeder nation in that it provides a lion's share of goods and services to the hegemon, thereby not only rapidly improving its own standard of living, but also beginning to salivate at the prospect of dethroning its master once it has stolen its technological know-how. Today, one only has to look at how China has been stealing America's technological know-how in return for being its feeder ever since its revolutionary leader Deng Xiaoping signed an historic trade pact with the then 39th POTUS Jimmy Carter in 1979, almost in a parallel with the start of summer 1976 to 1996 of the current Aquanium. Prior to China, America stole Britain's technological know-how during the 19th century in return for being its feeder, and in doing so knocked Britain off his hegemonic perch. For its part, Britain stole much of French technology during the 18th century, and France did it to Netherlands during the 17th century, and so forth. 3. Autumn. Hegemon begins to unravel. With little to do at home, the hegemon starts creating bogus service-oriented jobs aplenty and additionally ratchets up unnecessary bureaucracy to keep the masses occupied, lest their idle hands erupt into a socio-political upheaval. Not that they will never do so, but such a fool's errand nonetheless helps to buy time, all the while furnishing big fat handouts to others who have no drive for work and have become accustomed to an easy life under the guise of social welfare. Top that up with the fact that the hegemon is now largely powered by low-paid immigrants in that they feed the masses, raise their kids, do their dirty laundry, and even build their homes and offices. Due to the lack of challenging and rewarding work in the service industry and even at home, thanks to immigrants taking care of everything, the masses begin to unravel through self-indulgence and hedonistic pleasure, while others start to suffer from addiction and mental disease. In parallel with the woes of the masses, what has now become the 800-pound gorilla of bureaucratic oversight puts the intellectuals and creative minds in the pincer hold, thereby kissing innovation and entrepreneurship goodbye to add to a faltering infrastructure at home due to its negligence for decades. To make up for the loss in productivity and innovation at home, the hegemon prints ever more money and borrows to the hilt so as to make up for all else having failed and keeping the masses addicted to living beyond their means, as well as to fund unnecessary self-destructive wars against the nations with the potential resources in a last-ditch effort to flex its muscles in the hope that perhaps something can be salvaged out of others' misfortunes. One only has to look at America's unraveling, beginning almost in a parallel with the start of autumn 1997 to 2017 of the current Aquanium, to see that the proof of such proclamation lies in the pudding, from pursuing self-destructive gambits such as the 9/11 wars to printing and borrowing money to the hilt. Likewise, Britain also faced a similar fate, just as the autumn 1913 to 1933 of the previous Aquanium kicked off, as it immediately got embroiled in World War I, driven by the conviction that it would be a boon to turn its sinking Titanic around, yet it ended up sinking even faster than it would have had it not been a party to precipitating that global conflict. In the face of the moral fabric of the society having been decimated, the hegemon begins to crumble under its own weight of a plethora of wrongdoings, from societal ills through excesses and imbalances to transgressions. The resulting socio-political upheaval quickly turns into an insoluble Rubik's Cube that can only be resolved through a global conflict. 4. Winter. Hegemon falls from grace. The fall from grace of hegemon is all but complete against the backdrop of typically the feeder nation vying to hold its own and challenging for global dominance. The resulting standoff and the contest for the control of world's resources is often resolved through a global conflict, with the hegemon being given a bloody nose if refusing to bow out peacefully as the Oqual cycle nears its end. While Britain bowed out gracefully in the face of rising American dominance during the winter 1934 to 1954 of the previous Aquanium, though in large part due to having been fixated on the rising threat of Germany and therefore not having seen America as a potential threat to its hegemony, it is unlikely that the United States will be willing to make way for China peacefully as the winter 2018 to 2038 of the current Aquanium draws to a close. What would be a bloody World War III is all but set to provide the stage over the next decade or so, as it oversees the coronation of China to take up the baton of global hegemony from America. Taken together, the hegemon essentially digs its own grave after having become globally dominant. In particular, global hegemony serves as a curse in disguise, in that it turns a respectable and honorable nation into a society of parasites who become accustomed to sucking blood of weaker nations, and then they pay a hefty price for their transgressions. The plight of the hegemon is very much akin to a wealthy family whose riches can easily make or break the offspring depending on how they are raised. In order to get a glimpse of how the hegemony of various global powers has been foxtrotting with each spell of an Oqual cycle since the birth of modern age, let us take a look at each one of them in a chronological order, beginning with the Portugal and then followed by Spain, before we move on to the trio of Netherlands, France, and Britain, and then finally round off our journey with America against the backdrop of China, rubbing its hands with Siberian glee and feet with Indian ghee, as it prepares to take up the baton of global leadership over the next decade or so as the current Aquanium draws to a close. Enter Portugal. Subsection titled, Portugal was the first bona fide global power whose hegemony largely coincided with the first Aquanium, 1451 to 1534. Although its birth can be traced back to 1415 with the conquest of Ceuta, a city located at the northernmost tip of Morocco but ceded to Spain in 1668, it was not until the development of a more advanced maritime technology, almost in parallel with the emergence of a printing press by German inventor Johannes Gutenberg circa 1451, that the Portuguese Empire truly came of age and quickly began to dwarf other rival powers by leaps and bounds. While other imperial powers of his time and those that came before had primarily relied on land to expand their sphere of power, such that their influence was largely restricted to the comfort zone of Afro-Eurasia centered around the Mediterranean Sea, Portugal would colonize regions in far-flung corners of the world due to being the first nation to have developed long-distance maritime capabilities. Powered by what were then their avant-garde naval carracks or ships, the Portuguese were the first among humanity to step outside their comfort zone and set up trade links elsewhere around the globe, beginning almost in tandem with the start of the first Aquanium. What were the groundbreaking naval milestones of the Portuguese explorers? In 1456, led by Álvaro Fernandes, the Portuguese were likely the first humans to land on what was then the uninhabited archipelago of Cape Verde, located in the Atlantic Ocean off the coast of Western Africa. The archipelago would begin to receive its first permanent human settlers in 1462 and remained under the control of Portugal until 1975, when it became an independent nation. In 1471, led by Fernão Gomes, the Portuguese would expand their imperial radius along the coast of southern Africa as they set foot on what is today Elmina, a city located on the south coast of Ghana, and would set up a trading post in 1478 to manage the lucrative trade of commodities such as gold and ivory. In 1482, led by Diogo Sau, the Portuguese would become the first Europeans to cross the equator along the western coast of southern Africa as they explored what are modern-day nations of Congo, Angola, and Namibia. In 1488, led by Bartolomeu Dias, the Portuguese became the first Europeans to reach what is today the Cape of Good Hope in South Africa as they continue to expand their monopoly of trade along the western coast of Africa. Once the Portuguese explorers had conquered the daunting equator, driven by the angst that perhaps they would simply fall over the edge under the force of gravity and may never return home, there was simply no stopping the Lusitanians in their long-stated goal of linking Europe to Asia via a maritime route in order to capitalize on the spice trade, which up until then had only been possible via overland routes across Eurasia and Africa, as well as to spread Christianity in an effort to counter the growing influence of Islam, to which the Portuguese were hardly strangers, as Muslim rule over the Iberian Peninsula had existed in one form or another for almost 800 years, 711 to 1492. Why did the Portuguese make linking Europe to Asia via a maritime route the holy grail of their explorations on their carracks? There were three reasons for establishing such a maritime link. 1. Security. Traveling by sea was much safer than overland routes, which were fraught with danger and required careful maneuvering through war zones, as well as to avoid being ambushed and looted. 2. Efficiency. The carracks could carry much more cargo than a cumbersome caravan of camels, thereby increasing efficiency and reducing shipping costs. And 3. Speed. While the carracks barely sailed a little faster than the camels could stride on their feet, they nevertheless had an advantage in being kept on the move non-stop, unlike a caravan that must be fed and rested at night. So, when did the Portuguese reach Asia? In 1498, led by Vasco da Gama, the Portuguese would become the first Europeans and finally realize their dream of reaching resource-rich Asia as their carracks docked at what is today Calicut, a city located along the Malabar coast in the southwestern state of Kerala in India. A truly momentous feat that would have been equivalent to humanity's landing on the moon in 1969, the Portuguese Empire had arguably touched the peak of its global dominance after having reached India and returning home with bucket loads of goodies to the delight of their royals. So contagious was the aroma of Indian spices that it would quickly infect other European royals from the French through the Dutch to the British, for whom reaching India would become the benchmark to gauge the success of their own imperial ambitions. But not so much for Spain. In what came to be called the 1494 Treaty of Tordesillas, Portugal and Spain signed an agreement to steer clear of each other in their exploratory endeavors, with the former given a monopoly roughly stretching over the eastern Atlantic Ocean and the latter over the western Atlantic Ocean. For this reason, Spain would never reach India, but rather focus its maritime efforts on the New World. As for Portugal, its love affair with India would deepen fast and furious, and unlike the short-lived teenage infatuation, it would soon turn into hasta la muerte, bebe, till death us do part, bebe. In 1500, the Portuguese would establish their first ever trading post on Indian soil at Calicut against the backdrop of their arch-rival Spain vying to hold its own. In 1505, the construction of several forts along the southwestern coast of India to protect its trading interests would effectively mark the beginning of Portuguese colonial rule on Indian soil that would last until the handover of what is today the southwestern coastal state of Goa to India in 1961. In order to expand their spice trade beyond India, the Portuguese would soon thereafter conquer key coastal regions across Southeast Asia, including the likes of what are today the Malaysian state of Malacca, 1511, and the Chinese region of Macau, 1557. However, what would become the eternal and most palpable legacy of the Portuguese Empire would not be planted in Asia, but rather in South America. In 1500, led by Pedro Álvares Cabral, the Portuguese first set foot on what is today the Brazilian city of Porto Seguro. Subsequent colonization of what is modern-day Brazil would not only bring more riches to the Portuguese through the highly profitable trade of precious commodities such as gold, diamond, sugar, and Brazil wood, but it would also conceive what is today the fifth largest country by landmass and seventh most populous nation in the world. However, Portuguese success also planted its own downfall as colonial riches soon began to weigh on its ruling elite that had become accustomed to biting off more than it could chew. With Spain lurking in its shadow, it would only be a matter of time before Portugal would begin to look to its past for unrivaled glory. Indeed, Spain had been quietly luring Portuguese explorers and their technological know-how into its own ranks with ever more lucrative contracts, including the legendary Christopher Columbus, who had gained all his maritime training on Portuguese ships. However, the pivotal moment for the shift of hegemonic power would come during the fifth phase of the so-called Italian Wars, straddling the Annus Horribilis, 1524, of the First Aquanium, which pitted Spain against France for the control of Italian peninsula as well as global dominance, with each side supported by various European powers. In the aftermath of what came to be called the 1529 Treaty of Cambrai, Spain would emerge as the dominant global power, ousting Portugal that had up till then been the trailblazer in establishing maritime trade and colonization of far-flung continents. Although its imperial links in one way or another would stretch across almost 6 centuries, beginning with the conquest of Ceuta in 1415 and ending with the handover of Macau to China in 1999, the global dominance of the Portuguese Empire over other rival powers and hence its golden age was largely restricted over the course of the first Equanium before the Spanish Empire would take up the baton of global hegemony. Nevertheless, Portugal can take pride in its imperial legacy in that not only Portuguese culture is celebrated across many corners of the world today, but the Portuguese language also serves as a lingua franca of nations much larger than itself, such as Brazil, Angola, and Mozambique. Adiós, Portugal. Bienvenida, España. Next subsection. Spain stole the show during the Second Equanium, 1535 to 1618. In 1492, exactly midway through the first Equanium since the birth of modern age in 1451, the maiden journey made by the Italian explorer Cristoforo Colombo, better known by his anglicized alias Christopher Columbus, through the Atlantic Ocean to reach India in search of spices, accidentally ended up in the New World. What would later come to be called the Americas, the 1492 voyage by Columbus, marked a tipping point in the fortunes of the Portuguese Empire that up till then had been calling the shots, as it had been the dominant global power for many decades and would continue to be so for several more. Why did that mark a tipping point for Portugal? Rather than Portugal, the serendipitous exploration of the Americas by Columbus was being funded by its arch-rival Spain, and it signaled a harbinger of things to come, or rather the beginning of a change of guards for the global dominance from one power to another. This was particularly poignant given that Columbus had received his exploratory know-how with the Portuguese ships, and his defection to Portugal's arch-rival was nothing short of having bitten the hand that once used to feed him. Although it traces its roots to the conquest of the Canary Islands off the coast of Morocco that first began in 1402, it would not be until the 1492 voyage of Columbus to the New World that the Spanish Empire would truly begin to flex its muscles and put a grin on its face. That ocean-shattering year at the closing of the 15th century would also mark another turning point in the rapidly bloating fortunes of the Spanish Empire with what came to be called the 1492 Reconquista, when the lost Muslim stronghold over Granada fell to Spain and Muslim rule over the Iberian Peninsula since 711 finally came to an abrupt end after nearly 800 years. How did the New World come to be called the Americas? Soon after the 1492 voyage of Columbus, another Italian explorer, Amerigo Vespucci, would follow in his compatriot's footsteps to the New World on behalf of the Spanish Empire. Notwithstanding his multiple trips to the New World over the next decade or so, Columbus, however, continued to argue that the landmass that he had discovered was a contiguous part of Asia rather than a new continent. However, Vespucci broke ranks with Columbus as he claimed the New World to be a separate entity, and quite rightly, the new continent would be named America in his honor, a Latinized form of his first name, Amerigo. The division of Vespucci's America into two Americas is quite recent and largely gained traction as a European colonization came to a grinding halt during the 19th century and paved the way for the development of distinct cultural identities between what is today North America and South America. The discovery of tectonic plates during the 20th century further reaffirmed the notion that North America and South America were two distinct continents. When did the Spanish begin to colonize the Americas? Soon after the 1492 voyage by Columbus, the Spanish would begin to explore and colonize much of Central and South America, a pursuit that was largely driven by the mouth-watering prospect of trading precious commodities such as gold, silver, and sugar. However, the Spanish explorations of the New World were also motivated by their desire to preach Christianity and proselytize the native tribes, though they ended up killing most of them through the introduction of deadly pathogens such as smallpox and measles, to which the indigenous people had no immunity, and many of those who survived would be butchered to make way for Europeans. With the exception of the Portuguese colonization of the eastern coast of South America that would later become what is modern-day Brazil, the Spanish pretty much had a free reign over the New World as granted by the 1494 Treaty of Tordesillas, which had required the only other major maritime power of the time, Portugal, to limit its explorations over the eastern Atlantic Ocean, while letting Spain have the monopoly over what lay on the other side of western Atlantic Ocean. In 1503, the Spanish would build the first sugar mill on the island of Hispaniola, home to modern-day nations of Dominican Republic and Haiti. In 1511, the Spanish colonized what is the modern-day island nation of Cuba and soon thereafter discovered huge gold deposits that would subsequently spark off the so-called 1512 Cuban gold rush. In 1513, the Spanish discovered what is the modern-day U.S. state of Florida. In 1516, back on European soil, the fortunes of the Spanish Empire would bloat with the inheritance of a handful of other European crowns, courtesy of royal marriages through the so-called Habsburg dynasty of Germanic origin that ruled during much of the second millennium over Central Europe under the political entity called the Holy Roman Empire, with the modern-day Austria being its nucleus. Through such a dynastic union, Spain would extend its suzerainty over parts of what are modern-day France, Italia, Germany, Austria, Belgium, and the Netherlands. In 1521, the Spanish would continue their steadfast march in the Americas, virtually unchallenged, as they began colonizing what is modern-day nation of Mexico after defeating the native Aztec Empire. In 1530, after having been emboldened by their emergence as the dominant power on the European continent in the wake of the fifth phase of the so-called Italian Wars, almost in parallel with the start of the Second Quadrennium, the Spanish would up the ante on their colonial ambitions as they began to put down the marker in the Americas. In 1532, the Spanish would take on the native Inca Empire, stretching across much of what are modern-day nations of Ecuador, Peru, and Chile along the western coast of South America. In 1536, the Spanish landed on what is modern-day Argentinian capital of Buenos Aires. In 1539, the Spanish inaugurated the first printing press in what is modern-day Mexico City. In 1551, the Spanish laid the foundation of what is the modern-day Universidad Nacional Autónoma de México. In 1580, after having colonized much of Central and South America, the Spanish Empire would reach the peak of its global dominance over other rival powers, particularly after the unification of the kingdoms and imperial possessions of Portugal and Spain into a single political entity called the Iberian Union. When Spain invaded Portugal after it fell into an existential crisis in the wake of the death of his king without an heir apparent. Given their ever-expanding empire stretching from Eurasia through Africa to the Americas, coupled with bountiful resources being imported en masse from the New World, the Spanish must have felt reassured that the Almighty's blessings would perhaps never put an end to their riches, particularly having the Holy Roman Empire in bed with them. Alas, with riches comes a corruption and moral disintegration of human society, and the Spanish would be no exception to this unforgiving law of nature. This should have been hardly surprising given that the best days of the Spanish Empire were already in the rearview mirror with the Annus Aeternalis of 1577 of the second Aquanium having already rubbed shoulders with Los Toros even before the Iberian Union came into being in 1580. Indeed, the constant stream of precious metals such as gold and silver pouring in from the New World without the production of new goods and services to have gone with them would only fuel consumer price inflation at home against the backdrop of Spanish having become heavily dependent upon the import of raw materials and manufactured goods from other countries in an echo of the plight of today's America. Given such excesses and imbalances that would lead to heavy taxation and a heavy-handed approach against other Europeans under their imperial authority through the Habsburg dynasty, it would only be a matter of time before the Spanish Empire would begin to unravel and face revolts. With the ominous second half 1577 to 1618 of the second Aquanium having already arrived, the writing had indeed been on the wall for some time. In 1581, what is modern-day Protestant nation of Netherlands would declare independence from the Catholic monarchs of the Spanish Empire after decades of oppression and persecution against the backdrop of what came to be known as the 80 Years' War, 1568 to 1648. A sluggish and drawn-out multi-decadal conflict that pitted the rising Dutch Empire against the decaying Spanish Empire, with each supported by various European powers. Although Netherlands would not clear the final hurdles against the deeply rooted Spanish Empire until after the final phase of the 80 Years' War, it nevertheless had gained an upper hand and dethroned Spain several decades earlier as the dominant global power in the wake of the sixth and consequential phase of the 80 Years' War, 1599 to 1609, when the Dutch forces not only scored land and naval victories against their former masters, but the heavy cost of the war also left Spain with no choice but to declare state bankruptcy, though that was also triggered in no small part due to the rather overstretched Spanish Empire across the globe having turned into a bogeyman, usurping ever more resources but delivering fewer and fewer rewards. In fact, against the backdrop of gargantuan excesses and imbalances as the 16th century closed out, the Spanish morale had fallen so low in that they could not even hold their own against the then English rookies during a naval face-off in the English Channel in what is widely referred to as the 1588 Spanish Armada. Taking on the mighty Dutch a decade later would therefore prove to be a whole different ballgame against men rather than boys. that the sixth phase of the 80 Years' War, straddling the Annus Horribilis 1608 of the Second Aquanium, would catapult the mighty Dutch to global preeminence just in time for the arrival of the Third Aquanium 1619 to 1702, speaks volumes about the dire spell of Oqual cycle on the incumbent hegemon, mired in self-indulgence, corruption, and exploitation of other nations. It was not just on the European soil that the fearless Dutch would put one up against the Spanish, but they would also begin to seize Iberian colonies across the globe almost in parallel with the beginning of an auspicious spell of the first half, 1619 to 1660, of the Third Aquanium. As for Spain, the Dutch insult would soon turn into Portuguese injury with the breakup of the Iberian Union in 1640. If being given a bloody nose by the Dutch had not served as a signal that Los Toros no longer possessed the Midas touch in the wake of the sixth phase of the 80 Years' War, 1599 to 1609, the quasi-velvet divorce with Portugal most certainly marked the end of global dominance of the Spanish Empire in 1640. That would follow the Catalan Revolt 1640 to 1659, which would keep Spain bogged down at home for another couple of decades, all the while the fortunes of the Dutch Empire would continue to swell as it took up the baton of global dominance against the backdrop of rapid disintegration of its former master. Although its imperial links in one way or another would stretch across almost 6 centuries, beginning with the maiden, albeit failed conquest of Canary Islands in 1402 and ending with its withdrawal from Western Sahara in 1975, the global dominance of the Spanish Empire over other rival powers and hence its golden age was largely restricted over the course of the Second Aquanium before the Dutch Empire would take up the baton of global hegemony. Nevertheless, Spain can take heart from its imperial legacy in that not only Spanish culture is celebrated across much of the Americas today, but Spanish language also serves as a lingua franca of almost 24 nations, ranking only second to the English language in terms of its global impact. And of course, the globe's love affair with Spain will forever remain as strong as a bull through Encierro and El Clásico. Que será España? Inter Netherlands. Next subsection. Dutch dominate the globe during the Third Aquanium, 1619 to 1702. With imperial ambitions of their own, the dynastic union of the Spanish Empire with the Habsburg dynasty in 1516 was a blessing in disguise for the Dutch in that they would get to hone their exploratory skills firsthand around the globe with the big boys who had already made the conquest of the New World look like a cakewalk. What appears to be a customary feature of the transition of power, it seems that the hegemon digs its own grave by nurturing its rival on milk and meat without even realizing that the hand being used to feed would be bitten sooner or later. And so the Dutch, working in the service of the Spanish, stood to benefit from their avant-garde maritime know-how, not to mention that they would also steal much of the proprietary technology of navigation in deep oceans, just as their masters had done it to the Portuguese before them. Add to that the millennia-old history of the Dutch having mastered the art of how to tame wind and water due to their low-lying and flood-prone terrain, and you get the best of both worlds. Indeed, the Dutch ingenuity would take their maritime know-how acquired under the tutelage of their masters to a new level such that their own ships would soon overshadow the Spanish fleet and begin to rule the ocean waves as the 17th century rolled in. When did the Dutch Empire come into being? The roots of the Dutch Empire can be traced back to 1581 with their maiden, albeit failed attempt to establish a colony in what is today the Pomeroon-Supernome region of Guyana, located on the northern coast of South America. A truly bold effort, given that the Dutch had yet to break free from the shackles of the Spanish Empire. Nevertheless, the fledgling Dutch Empire would taste its first colonial success in 1595 when the Dutch ships reached the Indonesian island of Java and in doing so signed their first ever contract to trade spices from Asia to Europe to the ire of the Portuguese, who up till then had a complete monopoly over that lucrative market for almost a century. Soon thereafter, a head-to-head clash of the Titans would break out and last more than 60 years through what came to be called the Dutch-Portuguese War, 1602 to 1663. A long and protracted conflict across the globe during which the Dutch would significantly weaken the remaining vestiges of the Portuguese Empire, primarily through capturing their colonial possessions, all the while the demoralized Spanish would leave their Iberian partner all by itself to fend and defend in the face of adversity. In 1603, the Dutch fleet attacked and blockaded but failed to capture Goa, the headquarters of the then Portuguese India and the modern-day southwestern Indian state. In 1605, the Dutch opened their first ever trading post on Indian soil in what is modern-day coastal city of Machilipatnam in the southeastern Indian state of Andhra Pradesh. However, it was not until their triumph over the Spanish during the sixth phase of the 80 Years' War, 1599 to 1609, that the Dutch Empire would truly come of age and begin to put down its colonial marker across the globe, particularly in light of having emerged as the dominant global power over its European rivals. Buoyed by their status as the new sheriff in town, earned almost in parallel with the arrival of the third Aquanium, there was no stopping the plucky Dutch from what they could and would not achieve over the next 84 years or so. In 1614, on the Western Front, the Dutch began to colonize much of the northeastern coast of what is modern-day United States that they would name New Netherland. In 1623, on the Western Front, the Dutch would seize what is today the southeastern Brazilian state of Bahia from the Portuguese, and soon thereafter would also colonize much of the northeastern coast of Brazil. In 1625, on the Eastern Front, the Dutch would exercise complete monopoly over the lucrative spice trade from the Indonesian archipelago of Maluku Islands at the expense of the Portuguese. In 1626, on the Western Front, the Dutch purchased what is today the borough of Manhattan from the native tribes and named it New Amsterdam, which would be later renamed to New York by the British in 1666. In 1634, on the Western Front, the Dutch seized from the Spanish what is today the Caribbean nation of Curaçao off the northern coast of South America. In 1641, on the Eastern Front, the Dutch captured the trading posts from the Portuguese in what is the modern-day Malaysian state of Malacca. In 1642, on the Eastern Front, the Dutch captured what is modern-day Taiwan from the Spanish to further exert their supremacy. In 1650, on the Western Front, the Dutch colonized what is modern-day nation of Suriname on the northern shores of South America. In 1652, on the Eastern Front, the Dutch established a settlement on the Cape of Good Hope in South Africa. By 1658, on the Eastern Front, the Dutch would have all trading posts on the island nation of Sri Lanka under their thumb after years of having laid siege to the Portuguese who were sent packing home. By 1663, on the Eastern Front, the Dutch had amassed an equally impressive array of colonial posts dotted across all corners of irresistible India, stretching from what are modern-day Indian states of Gujarat on the northwestern coast, through the Malabar coast and Tamil Nadu on the southern coast, to Andhra Pradesh and West Bengal on the eastern coast, to add to the ever-growing woes of the Portuguese, who nevertheless kept renewing their vows and praying for divine intervention to never have to be separated from their most spicy colony till death in the face of Dutch onslaught showing no signs of easing. Before too long, the Portuguese prayers would indeed be answered in no uncertain terms with the onset of the second half, 1661 to 1702, of the third Aquanium, as it would bear bad omens for the Dutch in line with the dire spell of the second half of Oqual cycle on the hegemon. Enter the British and French spoilers, or rather the saviors. While the rise of the British Empire in its shadows had always been a thorn in the flesh of the Dutch hegemony ever since their first sparring encounter in what came to be called the First Anglo-Dutch War, 1652 to 1654, during which the British Navy attacked the Dutch merchant ships in the English Channel so as to ward them off from trading with Britain in an effort to exercise complete monopoly over its own maritime borders. The hostilities between the emerging British power and the dominant Dutch power would, however, grow much deeper than the ocean with the onset of the second half, 1661 to 1702, of the third Aquanium. In what came to be known as the Second Anglo-Dutch War, 1665 to 1667, during which the Dutch would cede their rule in entirety over New Netherland, including the handover of Manhattan, the British would not only significantly weaken Dutch hegemony over global trade, but the Achilles heel of Netherlands would also be laid bare to the delight of its European rivals, particularly France, with its own aspirations of becoming a dominant global player. Buoyed by such a mouth-watering prospect and driven by their motto, battre le fer quand il est chaud, pound the iron when it is hot, the French, with the blessings of the British, would open up their own front against the decadent Netherlands through the so-called Franco-Dutch War, 1672 to 1678. During that conflict, much of the Netherlands would be initially overrun, but the Dutch regrouped and beat back the French, forcing them to bury the hatchet in what was essentially a war of attrition, but it nevertheless signaled that the days of Dutch hegemony were numbered. As for the Portuguese, they could not have been more thankful to Virgencita de Lisboa against the backdrop of a concerted effort by the British and the French to keep the Dutch hegemony in check, lest it decimated what little remained of Portugal's imperial legacy. Not to mention that the Lusitanians were also relieved to see the backup being stalked and pursued around the globe by the Dutch, a la lovers from hell. What caused the rapid decline of the Dutch masters? With a vast network of colonial outposts scattered across the globe, the Dutch literally became filthy rich during the 17th century through trading a vast array of commodities from nutmeg and opium through sugar and rice to cotton and silk. In sync with their global hegemony during much of the 17th century, the Dutch also developed what was arguably the world's first global currency in the guilder, and a banking system that would serve as the kernel upon which rests today's modern financial system. However, it is an open secret that the wealth kills the health and the greed buries the creed of a society. Indeed, the jinx of the colonial riches would soon begin to engulf the Dutch society, as epitomized by the self-indulgence of younger generations and their waning zest for life against the backdrop of endemic corruption as the 17th century closed in. To say that the fall of Netherlands from grace was just as quick as its rise would be to put it Dutchly. With the Annus Horribilis 1692 of the third Aquanium lurking on the horizon, the time to pass on the baton of global hegemony had all but arrived. With its own ambitions of rising to global hegemony brewing fast, France would begin to feverishly salivate at the prospect of now or never, in the wake of witnessing the rapid decline of the Dutch and its European allies being in utter disarray, as underscored by their internal conflicts, coupled with the existential crisis having befallen England through the so-called Glorious Revolution, 1688 to 1689. A socio-political uprising triggered by the alienization of what was then a largely Protestant nation by the newly crowned Catholic monarch James II, followed by his deposition and subsequent accession to the throne of his Protestant daughter Mary II and her Dutch husband William III, who also happened to be the de facto leader of the Netherlands, as co-monarchs of England, as well as Wales, Scotland, and Ireland, due to the dynastic union of the Quad since 1603. Even the quasi-dynastic union facilitated by the Glorious Revolution with England would not save Dutch hegemony from the onslaught of indomitable French determined to rewrite history. Driven by what had arguably grown into the most powerful military, against the backdrop of his European rivals facing one crisis after another, the mighty French would indeed waste no time and move in for the kill in order to rise to their own glory, as well as motivated by the urgency to prevent the dynastic union of England and Netherlands through what came to be called the 9 Years' War, 1688 to 1697. A contest for global hegemony that erupted just before the outbreak of Glorious Revolution, pitting the rising power of France all by itself against the Grand Alliance spearheaded by the Dutch and closely supported by much of what are modern-day England, Spain, Portugal, Germany, Austria, Switzerland, Belgium, and Italy. Although the main theater lay in Europe, the bloody 9 Years' War was the first ever large-scale global conflict that would be fought on the shores of every major continent, from the Americas through Eurasia to Africa. In North America, France would lock horns with the then emerging power of England for the control of colonial outposts. In the Caribbean, France would take on the combined naval forces of Spain and England. In Asia, France would go on the offensive against the combined naval forces of Netherlands and England. In spite of so many European powers acting in concert across all the corners of the world to tame the alpha male, France nevertheless held its own and single-handedly gave them all a heck of a run for their money, all the while decimating the Dutch economic engine and effectively putting an end to its hegemony. In what came to be called the 1697 Treaty of Ryswick, all parties would finally agree to end the costly conflict that barely moved a needle in anyone's direction in terms of strategic gains or losses, though the French aggression had undoubtedly dethroned the Dutch, making way for France to emerge as the new dominant global power on the back of a powerful army, the most advanced naval force, and a far-reaching maritime trade network, just as the third Aquanium drew to a close. Although its imperial links in one way or another would stretch across almost 4 centuries, beginning with the maiden, albeit failed, conquest of Guyana in 1581 and ending with Suriname being granted independence in 1975, the global dominance of the Dutch Empire over other rival powers, and hence its golden age, was largely restricted over the course of the third Aquanium before the French Empire would take up the baton baton of global hegemony. Still, Netherlands can take delight in its imperial legacy in that not only much of today's financial system traces its roots to the Dutch Golden Age, but the Dutch language also continues to command a sizable following across all four major continents. Tot ziens, Netherlands. Bienvenue, France. Next subsection. France fashions the world during the Fourth Aquanium, 1703 to 1786. The roots of the French Empire can be traced to 1534 with the exploration of what is modern-day Gulf of St. Lawrence, sandwiched between the Canadian provinces of Quebec and Newfoundland as it empties into the Atlantic Ocean. A few decades later, that maiden excursion by the French explorers would be followed by multiple attempts to colonize warmer regions in the New World, such as the modern-day Brazilian city of Rio de Janeiro, 1555, and the U.S. state of Florida, 1562, but to no avail due to the then strong colonial oversight of the Spanish and Portuguese, who between them had already laid claims to the strategic points across the globe as they were the first to settle where no other European had ever dared to do so. However, the rapid decline of the Spanish and Portuguese colonial might as the 17th century rolled in would open up the door for other Europeans, and only then would French colonization gain traction in earnest. In particular, the French explorers capitalized on the maritime know-how of what were now the trio of pace-setters in the Portuguese, Spanish, and Dutch ships, and by the end of 17th century, France itself would become a leading maritime power, eclipsing its European rivals. But first came the baby steps, one at a time. In 1608, the French would establish a settlement in what is modern-day Canadian province of Quebec to begin fur trade. In 1625, the French would begin their settlement on the island of Tortuga off the northern coast of modern-day Caribbean nation of Haiti. In 1630, France colonized what is the modern-day French overseas territory of Guyane, or French Guiana, located on the northern coast of South America. In 1635, France colonized what is the modern-day French overseas territory of Martinique in the Caribbean, and over the next couple of decades, it would also control many other Caribbean islands. In 1668, the French established their first ever trading post on Indian soil in the modern-day northwestern state of Gujarat, and over the next several decades, they would open up additional fortified factories dotted across both the western and eastern coasts of India, with Puducherry becoming their headquarters. In 1682, the French explored the Mississippi River and laid claim to what is modern-day U.S. state of Louisiana. In 1697, in the aftermath of the 9 Years' War that cemented the supremacy of France over its European colonial rivals, the western half of Hispaniola, corresponding to the modern-day nation of Haiti, would be ceded by the Spanish to the French. Once having emerged as the most dominant global power, almost in a parallel with the arrival of the Fourth Aquanium, the French supremacy would be put to the test right away through what came to be known as the Spanish Succession War, 1701 to 1714, in the midst of a new dawn renowned for heralding the emergence of new institutions at the expense of old ones. What was the Spanish Succession War about? Triggered by the death of childless Spanish monarch Charles II in 1700, the Spanish Empire was plunged into a crisis of epic proportions. Without an heir apparent, the appointment of Charles II's successor to the Spanish throne was now a matter of dispute between his blood relatives in the rival dynasties of German Habsburg and French Bourbon, with each respectively reigning over and beyond what are modern-day Austria and France. Given that Charles II had named his great-nephew Prince Philip, born to the French Bourbons, as his heir presumptive in his will, the accession to the Spanish throne by decree of the young French prince was, however, not welcomed by the German Habsburgs and other Europeans, in that they feared that a potential dynastic union between Spain and France would threaten the balance of power. This was particularly alarming, given that France had not only emerged as the dominant global power in the wake of the 9 Years' War, but that it now also stood to inherit a large Spanish empire scattered across the globe were that dynastic union to go through. Without a diplomatic solution, much of Western Europe would burst into another conflict of Spanish succession war, with the wounds from the 9 Years' War having yet to heal, and pretty much along similar warring factions, with France once again taking on the Grand Alliance made up much of what are modern-day Austria, Germany, Switzerland, Belgium, Italy, Netherlands, Britain, Portugal, and Spain, though the latter was split along Habsburg and Bourbon loyalties. After a decade of futile exercise of having battered each other, with each side becoming exhausted in a war of attrition, France nevertheless emerged as the kingmaker, with the young French prince now being recognized as King Philip V of Spain by all parties on the condition that there would be no dynastic union between Los Toros and Les Gaules. Being the new sheriff in town, France would not only call the shots and pull the levers of international politics over the next several decades, but it would also richly benefit from its colonies across the globe, serving as hubs of lucrative trade from fur, sugar, and coffee in the Americas to spices, cotton, and silk from India. Notably, in line with its national interests, France would play a central role in dictating a favorable outcome of the accession to the throne of new monarchs through first the Polish Succession War, 1733 to 1738, and then closely followed by the Austrian Succession War, 1740 to 1748. The latter conflict would also turn a centuries-old Habsburg-Bourbon rivalry into a strategic alliance. With France being obsessed with exerting its omnipotent authority over Europe, a la new Russian bride who could not be trusted running household affairs, it was inevitable that its overseas empire would remain vulnerable to its eternal enemy Britain, which for its part was not only rising fast and furious with its own hegemonic ambitions to shepherd the world, but had also prioritized its colonial empire over the never-ending family politics across the European continent. And so France's lax foreign policy would prove disastrous, particularly with the ominous Annus Turnilis 1745 of the Fourth Aquanium having already entered the rearview mirror. In what came to be known as the Carnatic Wars, 1744 to 1763, Britain would significantly weaken the French colonial grip on its Indian possessions and emerge as the dominant colonial power on the Asian diamond. That is all the more troubling given that France entered the Carnatic Wars as the odds-on favorite to gain an upper hand on the Indian peninsula with the capture of what was then Madras, the headquarters of the British Empire on Indian soil, but would soon lose the advantage due to prioritizing its hegemony in Europe rather than squander limited resources on overseas adventures with an unpredictable future, as they were a high-risk investment, unlike Britain, which had no choice but to only funnel its investments into its overseas empire. Against the backdrop of the Carnatic Wars, France and Britain would also lock horns in Europe and across the globe wherever their colonial possessions crisscrossed in what came to be called the 7 Years' War, 1756 to 1763. With each supported by their European allies, the British would significantly weaken the French hegemony across the globe, with the Les Gaules forced to cede to the Lions a handful of their North American territories as the 7 Years' War drew to a close. It is noteworthy that such a territorial cession was not driven due to Les Gaules being unable to hold their own against the Lions, but rather due to the fact that whereas France always had its cœur in Europe, Britain's heart was everywhere but in Europe for the reasons that would become clearer later on in this section. Although France would flex its muscles and show that it still had the teeth through the capture of what is today the French island of Corsica, directly off the northern coast of the Italian island of Sardinia in 1769, the days of French hegemony were all but over. With the Annus Horribilis 1776 of the fourth Aquanium now also lurking on the horizon, few would have bet that the French hegemony would defy the odds and keep the dire spell of an Oqual cycle at bay. With the trouble brewing within its own 13 colonies in North America, few would have also bet that it would be the Lions that would ultimately knock Les Gaules off their hegemonic perch. In what is referred to as the American Independence War, 1775 to 1783, France would indeed conspire with American colonists, largely out of his own grievances against his eternal enemy, and tip the balance of power in favor of what was then a tiny and fledgling nation without even a proper military gear running along the eastern coast of what is modern-day United States. In addition to providing American colonists with much-needed military know-how, wherewithal, troops, and his powerful navy, the French would also directly engage the British through the so-called Anglo-French War 1778 to 1783 in Europe as well as on North American shores. In doing so, the French would not only make American victory against what were now the mighty British on ascendance look like a cakewalk, but Les Gaules would also give the Lions a bloody nose through their own direct conflict. In the aftermath of America's push for independence, clearing its final hurdles in 1783, one might have been led to believe that the French hegemony had been resurrected after the British were sent packing home in the wake of their North American empire having been chopped in half. Rather, as is the case with all decadent hegemons being on their last leg due to overspending and being over-leveraged with debt, as the Oqual cycle draws to a close, France's myopic decision to spearhead the American Independence War against the British only exacerbated its financial woes as it served to empty out what little remained in its coffers, and before too long, Les Gaules would be bankrupt and their empire left in tatters. That the curtain over French hegemony had finally been drawn just as the Fourth Aquanium closed out was further underscored by the so-called French Revolution, 1789 to 1799. A bloody insurrection led by the peasants against the state in the face of dire financial straits, sparked by the overindulgence of the ruling elite, coupled with the poor economic policies to add to the heavy cost of participation in the American Independence War. In particular, the French Revolution was the result of centuries-old grievances and injustices amassed due to feudal practices such as the monarchy and aristocracy continuing to exploit the masses for their self-enrichment. The French Revolution heralded a new dawn on French soil in that it would lead to the creation of a constitutional monarchy coupled with the democratic rights for the masses as embodied in the motto Liberté, Égalité, Fraternité, at the expense of doing away with ancient practices of feudalism and absolute monarchy as epitomized by the execution of the French King Louis XVI by guillotine in 1793 and the rise of Napoleon Bonaparte as France's new statesman in 1799. While the American Independence War turned out to be a shot in the foot for the French in the face of what amounted to be nothing more than a Pyrrhic victory, it would be a godsend for the British. In fact, what appeared to be a loss for the British turned out to be a huge gain in the face of his arch-rival, left to lick his wounds and being unable to take care of itself, much less continue to be a leader of the world. Additionally, a loss can sometimes be a win in that it can help one to concentrate their energy where it matters most rather than spewing it out in all directions. For the ascendant British Empire with its own ambitions of global hegemony, the 13 colonies in North America were no longer profitable from an entrepreneurial angle in a manner akin to an adult child sticking around without a job and becoming a burden on the family. Given that the 13 colonies had grown up to fend for themselves, letting them go their own way would therefore have been the right thing to do anyway. While their liberation from the imperial crown may have been perceived to tarnish the prestige of the British Empire, it nevertheless paved the way for Britain to look elsewhere for its ultimate glory and riches to topple what little remained of French hegemony. With Britain having outmaneuvered its colonial rivals on the Indian Peninsula prior to the outbreak of the American Independence War, it was now time to channel its energy and time on the holy cow with milk and meat aplenty. The British must have wondered, why waste energy milking the last drop out of an old cow when we can get bucket loads at a fraction of the cost only if we are willing to go the extra mile? In hindsight, the American Independence War marked a new era of riches for the British Empire in that it was finally able to add the jewel to its crown with India knocking on the door, and in doing so, it would effectively dethrone France and emerge as the undisputed heavyweight hegemon, almost beginning in parallel with the arrival of the Fifth Aquanium, 1787 to 1870. As for the French, they would put up one last fight to salvage something out of nothing through the so-called Napoleonic Wars, 1803 to 1815, but it would be to no avail as Britain had already gone from strength to strength thanks to its timely divorce from the 13 colonies a couple of decades earlier that would not only put a stop to its bleeding, but also open the door to a highly profitable marriage with its Indian bride. Fast forward by some 200 years, and today's France has nevertheless every raison d'être joyeux, or reason to be joyful. Although its imperial links in one way or another would stretch across more than 4 centuries, beginning with reaching Montreal in 1534 and ending with its withdrawal from the island nation of Vanuatu in 1980, the global dominance of the French Empire over other rival powers, and hence its golden age, was largely restricted over the course of the Fourth Aquanium before the British Empire would take up the baton of global hegemony. While France would undoubtedly dominate affairs head and shoulders above its rivals on the European continent during much of the Fourth Aquanium, its global hegemony, however, left much to be desired, as it was often kept in check by Britain and sometimes even eclipsed. That was largely due to the fact that France's overseas policy was spasmodic at best, as it failed to heavily fortify its colonial outposts across the globe due to the following 3 reasons. 1. Sandwiched between an array of hostile European neighbors, France had to heavily invest in fortifying long stretches of its land borders to keep the adversaries out at home at the expense of fortifying its overseas territories to expand its empire. 2. Located at the heart of Europe, France became ambivalent about whether it should prioritize the expansion of its empire across large swaths of the European continent or whether it ought to devote more resources to its overseas territories. And 3. Being a Catholic nation, the French had for centuries believed, even before their rise to global hegemony, that they were the true standard bearers of Catholicism, and as such, they wasted far too much energy locking horns with their European rivals in an effort to call the shots and reign over much of what was then a predominantly Catholic Europe, in lieu of channeling their energy into their overseas territories. Had France been an island and a Protestant nation, the alpha male on testosterone would have easily pipped its arch-rival Britain to the title of the largest empire to have ever existed, and la langue française would have easily been lingua franca of the world today, though the French would argue, on s'en fiche, we do not care. Quel dommage, what a pity. Nevertheless, France can take heart from its imperial legacy in that not only French culture is celebrated across the globe today, but the French language also serves as lingua franca of at least a dozen nations, ranking only behind English and Spanish in terms of its global impact. And of course, the French not only invented testosterone, but also gave the world the alpha male. Au revoir, France. Enter Grande-Bretagne. Next subsection. Britain batters the globe over 2 consecutive Aquania, beginning with the 5th, 1787 to 1870, and ending with 6th, 1871 to 1954. The roots of the British Empire can be traced as far back as 1497, when English explorers led by their Italian talisman Giovanni Caboto accidentally landed on what is today the Canadian province of Newfoundland in lieu of their planned mission to reach Asia in search of spices. That costly debacle would put the then England's colonial ambitions on hold for almost a century, during which it would sharpen its tools on improving its maritime know-how, primarily through privateering Portuguese and Spanish ships. So, like the French and the Dutch, the British were also late to both the cisatlantic and transatlantic party. Nevertheless, after the political unification of the kingdoms of England and Wales into a single nation in 1535, with the duo having already been in a dynastic union since 1284, the British would get off their colonial mark in earnest as the 16th century neared its end. In 1585, the British would establish a temporary settlement in Roanoke Island off the coast of what is modern-day U.S. state of North Carolina. In 1607, the British would establish their first permanent colony in the New World on what is today a historic site of Jamestown in the U.S. state of Virginia, and over the following decades, they would begin to colonize other regions along the northeastern coast of what is modern-day United States, and often encroaching on Dutch settlements. In 1608, the British would set foot on Indian soil on what is today the coastal city of Surat in the western state of Gujarat, and over the following decades, they would begin to establish trading posts across both the western and eastern coasts, alongside and often encroaching on Portuguese territories, which had been established there since 1500. In 1623, the British would colonize what is the modern-day Caribbean nation of St. Kitts, and over the following decades, other Caribbean islands such as Barbados and Jamaica were also added to the imperial crown. In 1630, the British established a colony in what is the modern-day nation of Guyana, located on the northern coast of South America. In what came to be known as the Second Anglo-Dutch War, 1665 to 1667, the British would annex from the Dutch the so-called New Netherland, running along the northeastern coast of what is modern-day United States. With that morale-boosting victory, and after having emerged unscathed in the wake of the Glorious Revolution, 1688 to 1689, the British would up the ante and stamp their authority over their ever-expanding colonial outposts stretching across the globe from Asia to the Americas as the 17th century closed out. In 1707, the political unification of the duo of England and Wales with Scotland created what we know today as Great Britain, and only from this point onward, what was up till then the English and Welsh Empire would truly become the British Empire, whose global might would now rank only second to that of France, but ahead of its other European rivals. By 1752, Britain had amassed what came to be called the 13 colonies, running contiguously along the eastern coast of what are modern-day U.S. states of Massachusetts in the north to Georgia in the south. In 1770, Britain colonized what is the modern-day Australian state of New South Wales, and over the next several decades, the rest of the island would also fall under the British control. In 1795, Britain seized what is the modern-day Cape of Good Hope in South Africa from the Dutch, and over the next several decades, the British would also expand their colonial footprint across other strategic regions in Africa. Buoyed by its ever-bloating empire across the globe, it would now only be a matter of time before Britain would dislodge France from its hegemonic perch. In what came to be known as the Carnatic Wars, Britain would significantly weaken the French colonial grip on its Indian possessions and emerge as the dominant colonial power on the Asian diamond. Against the backdrop of the Carnatic Wars, Britain would also lock horns with France in Europe and across the globe in what came to be called the 7 Years' War, 1756 to 1763. On the Indian Peninsula, the British victory in the 1757 Battle of Plassey against the Mughal vestiges supported by the French military in what is modern-day eastern state of West Bengal would mark the birth of British Raj, 1757 to 1947. Though it was in no small part masterminded by the Lions to force the coup of the Mughal leadership by its own military chief Mir Jafar in return for a stake in the power. For his betrayal of his duty to his motherland, Mir Jafar continues to be reviled and derided even to this day across much of the Indian peninsula. On the North American shores, the British would significantly weaken the French hegemony with de Gaulle forced to cede to the Lions a handful of their colonial territories as the 7 Years' War drew to a close. Nevertheless, the British triumph in the 7 Years' War came at a heavy cost, particularly on North American shores. With the nation's debt rising fast and coffers running dry, Britain would move swiftly to impose a direct tax on its 13 colonies through what came to be known as the 1765 Stamp Act. However, the plan would backfire with a vengeance, as it would not only be opposed by the colonists, but their grievances would also quickly shift what was up till then a fringe movement demanding independence from Britain to the front and center of the then fledgling American society. With Britain refusing to back down, the rapidly bloating American tinderbox was set alight through the so-called American Independence War, 1775 to 1783. With the 13 colonies being wholeheartedly supported by Britain's arch-rivals, unable to fathom its rapid rise and led by France with the blessings of Spain and Netherlands, the Lions would bow out gracefully to the demands of American colonists without becoming scarred and left to lick their wounds. In fact, what appeared to be a loss for Britain turned out to be a blessing in disguise, in that the 13 colonies were no longer profitable and would have only been a drain on the precious resources of an empire on ascendancy. Ironically, the American Independence War would propel Britain to global hegemony at the expense of France, beginning almost in parallel with the arrival of the Fifth Aquanium, 1787 to 1870. The rise of Britain to global dominance was to a large extent facilitated by France's botched and bungled attempt to financially and materially support the American colonists during the American Independence War. A myopic gambit that would leave Les Gaules demoralized and bankrupt, with the Lions left to rub their paws with French glee and claws with Indian ghee. With Britain having outmaneuvered its colonial rivals on the Indian Peninsula prior to the outbreak of the American Independence War, it was now time to project its unparalleled power from another corner of the world. Admittedly, the American Independence War marked a new era of riches for the British Empire, not only through its rapid rise on the Indian Peninsula, but also across Africa and Australia. In particular, Britain would plunder the Indian Peninsula over the next couple of centuries through exploiting the masses to produce a wide array of commodities, from grain through spices to textiles, and then exporting them across the globe for hefty profits. The resulting wealth would be used to upgrade infrastructure and industry at home and across its vast global empire, thereby quickly bloating into an 800-pound gorilla that its rivals feared would be impossible to dethrone. It is indeed no coincidence that Britain's 18th century industrial revolution began almost in parallel with its global hegemony, and in particular after the birth of its colonial rule on the Indian Peninsula in 1757. The colonial riches would soon turn Britain into the toast of the town among its European admirers, and many of them would have had no qualms about entering into a marriage of convenience with the Lions. But Britain espoused the idea of not only love thy neighbor, but also marry thy neighbor. In 1801, driven by such a conviction, the political marriage of Great Britain with Ireland would create what we know today as the United Kingdom, and with that masterstroke, the British Empire would begin to not only rule the ocean waves like never before, but it would also come home in earnest. However, being the leader of the world also comes with a lot of headaches, particularly when one is left to deal with an alpha male on testosterone. Unaware, or perhaps refusing to accept the fact that there was a new sheriff in town, a resurgent France led by Napoleon would make one last-ditch effort to regain its supremacy in Europe and across the globe through the so-called Napoleonic Wars. 1803 to 1815. Without even flinching, Britain would quickly rise to the challenge and put one final nail in the coffin of what little remained of French hegemony on the back of a massive bankruptcy and a reign of terror that had unfolded during the French Revolution, 1789 to 1799. Only after the British had delivered the coup de grâce would it dawn upon France that it no longer possessed the Midas touch that it once did, and that it was time to take the back seat and let the Lions run the global show. With the alpha male having been finally tranquilized, Europe would take a sigh of relief against the backdrop of relative peace over the several decades that followed, but in the misguided belief that the happy times would perhaps never end, but they always do, thanks to the perpetual spell of Oqual cycle. With the Annus Horribilis 1860 of the fifth Aquanium lurking on the horizon, much of the globe would be plunged into utter chaos and bloodshed once more, beginning with the Crimean War 1853 to 1856, pitting the rising power of Russia against the ailing Ottoman Empire, with the latter supported by various European powers, with Britain and France leading the charge to maintain a balance of power. Although triggered by the dispute over the rights of Orthodox Christians in what is modern-day Israel-Palestine, then under the control of the Ottoman Empire, but with Russia demanding that the Ottoman's Orthodox subjects be placed under its direct protection, the Crimean War was also in no small part due to the Siberian tiger flexing its muscles and trying to boost its hegemony across the Eurasian continent. Backed by the vast network of his global empire in terms of both manpower and resources, Britain would crack down on Russian dissent through its unwavering backing of the Ottomans, with little at their disposal to challenge the British supremacy. However, the Crimean War also exposed the numerous shortcomings of the British military in terms of its logistical and tactical failures. That should have hardly raised eyebrows, given that hegemons fall prey to endemic corruption and self-indulgence as the Oqual cycle draws to a close. To add insult to injury, the Crimean War would be followed by the 1857 Indian Mutiny, a socio-political uprising and revolt by the Indian masses due to their own grievances after having been oppressed and exploited for almost a century at the hands of their British overlords. Nevertheless, the Indian rebellion would be put down quickly and the British colonial rule would reach new heights, with India now falling under the direct rule of the British Crown during the then Queen Victoria's reign through what came to be known as the 1858 Government of India Act. Long story short, Britain largely survived being dethroned as the Fifth Aquanium 1787 to 1870 neared its end due to the fact that there was simply no other rival big enough to topple its global hegemony, as elaborated below. 1. Russia was never a serious threat to Britain's hegemony due to largely being concerned with maintaining its gargantuan imperial footprint in Eurasia rather than having global ambitions. 2. Other potential rivals such as Italia, Japan, and Germany only came into being more or less at the outset of the Sixth Aquanium, 1871 to 1954, after the unification of a plethora of their respective weak and divided kingdoms. And 3. For its part, the modern-day America also came into being almost at the outset of the Sixth Aquanium after the Mexican cession of what is today much of American Southwest, from Texas to California, in the aftermath of the Mexican-American War, 1846 to 1848, and before too long, the fledgling nation would plunge into the so-called American Civil War, 1861 to 1865, right away rather than challenge Britain for global hegemony. Notably, the birth of what are modern-day nations of Italia, 1861, America, 1865, Japan, 1868, and Germany, 1871, almost in parallel with the arrival of Sixth Aquanium, 1871 to 1954, was no coincidence but exactly in line with the fact that new systems and institutions are born at the expense of old ones with the start of a new Oqual cycle. As for Britain, it would defy the Aquania old traditions of stepping aside and making way for a new sheriff in town, and instead go on to reach the peak of its global dominance just as the Sixth Aquanium kicked off. However, before too long, Britain's global hegemony would come to be kept in check by the rapid rise of Germany and America on either side of the Atlantic as the 19th century bid farewell. While Britain had dodged the Oqual bullet in having been able to retain its hegemony and being extended a new lease on life as the Fifth Aquanium closed out, its luck to evade the scourge of another Oqual cycle would nonetheless run out with the passing of the next and Sixth Aquanium. In particular, fearing the meteoric ascent of what was then the young and restless nation of Imperial Germany that had been carved out of the merger of numerous German states with a shared language and culture, just as the Sixth Aquanium kicked off, Britain would take extreme measures to counter the rising threat of the eagles, running the lines ragged on the European continent and thereby challenging its global hegemony. The outbreak of World War I, almost in tandem with the Annus Ternalis 1913 of the sixth Aquanium, would thus be a godsend for Britain to do exactly that. While there is no doubt that Germany started World War I to pursue its hegemonic goals, Britain's lukewarm diplomacy leading up to that conflict suggests that the then leader of the world saw a golden opportunity to advance his own strategic goals through wrecking his potential rival. Although the 1919 Treaty of Versailles would bring World War I to an end, its humiliating and draconian treatment of Germany as being the sole aggressor who would be forced to bear the full cost of the war and make territorial concessions was in no uncertain terms driven by their propaganda to cripple Deutschland, so much so that it would never be able to stand on its feet again, much less challenge anyone's hegemony ever again. While that propaganda headed by Britain undoubtedly neutralized Germany's threat to its hegemony, it somehow never dawned upon the Lions that it would not only come back to haunt them, but that another rising power from across the Atlantic was also salivating with its own ambitions of rising to global supremacy. Indeed, the 1919 Treaty of Versailles served no purpose but to only provoke the eagles to propel a madman to the nation's highest office, filled with hate and revenge for the humiliation of his country at the hands of his enemies. Before too long, Germany would once again square up against Britain and its allies with the outbreak of World War II. The heavy cost of World War II, both in terms of human life and monetary terms, would literally bankrupt Britain, as it would be forced to rapidly roll back its colonial empire and hand over the baton of global hegemony to America, just as the sixth Aquanium drew to a close. Although its imperial links in one way or another would stretch across more than 5 centuries, beginning with reaching Newfoundland in 1497 and ending with the handover of Hong Kong to China in 1997, the global dominance of the British Empire over other rival powers and hence its golden age was largely restricted over the course of the 5th and 6th Aquania before America would emerge as the new hegemon. Why did the British hegemony buck the trend in that it lasted 2 consecutive Aquania when all of its predecessors fizzled away after just 1 Aquanium, and its successor is also on track to follow that trend? In addition to the fact that there was no potential rival well positioned to topple Britain from its hegemonic perch as it completed the first of 2 Aquania in 1870, there were 3 other cooperative forces that bore good omens for the Lions. 1. Being an island nation with no land borders to share with hostile neighbors, Britain had a naturally impregnable hypermoat that not only required a little TLC to keep its defense in pristine shape at home, but it would also free up precious resources for the fortification of its overseas territories, unlike its European rivals. 2. With no contiguous neighbors to conquer or distract, Britain's fate was sealed, as it could only look out to the Atlantic rather than over continental Europe for expanding its empire. And 3. Being a Protestant nation, Britain's job of concentrating its energy and resources on colonizing far-flung regions across the globe was made all the easier, given that it would have been a fool's errand to even contemplate ruling over what was then a largely Catholic Europe. Had Britain lacked even one of these virtues, it is quite unlikely that the Lions would have been able to anglicize the world as much as they did. Indeed, Britain can take heart from its imperial legacy in that not only has a British culture become deeply endemic to most nations of the world today, but the English language also serves as a lingua franca of the globe in almost every domain of human civilization, from trade through arts to sciences. In fact, such has been the impact of the British legacy that anyone who can read and write today is expected to possess at least a basic command of the English language. Although Britain may no longer be calling the shots and pulling the levers of international politics as it once did, its impact on shaping global civilization will surely live on till eternity, not to mention that it still continues to punch well above its weight, with the Oqual cycle being its latest gift to the world at large. Goodbye, Britannia. Bienvenidos, Estados Unidos. Next subsection. America accessed the globe during the 7th Aquanium 1955 to 2038 as it prepares to hand over the baton to China. Unlike its predecessors having risen to global hegemony on the back of millennia-old history, America not only had very humble beginnings, but also surprised the other nations with its meteoric rise after its independence from Britain in 1776 in the wake of the American Independence War, just in time to welcome the arrival of the 5th Aquanium 1787 to 1870 with a bang of its own. Barely after having learned to walk on its own feet, the newly born nation would begin to expand its territory westward from what was then a narrow strip of land running contiguously along the eastern coast of what are modern-day U.S. states of Massachusetts in the north to Georgia in the south. In 1803, the then tiny United States purchased France's colonial possessions roughly stretching across the north-south corridor in what are the modern-day U.S. states of Louisiana in the south, cutting through Nebraska to Montana in the north. In 1812, after years of being choked by Britain in terms of its desire to continue expanding its territorial radius westward over native lands and its ability to freely trade with Europe, the then fledgling America would declare war on what was then the mighty British Empire in what can be referred to as the British-American War, 1812 to 1815, in the hope that it could strike a blow to the lions already showing signs of exhaustion due to having been bogged down for years in the Napoleonic Wars, 1803 to 1815, across the globe. However, partly driven by the urge to annex much of what is modern-day Canada, that gamble would backfire in no uncertain terms in that not only did it not help to resolve any of the nation's grievances, but it also severely damaged its honor and dignity. In 1814, in the midst of British-American War, America would suffer a huge setback after the British troops burned down the numerous Capitol buildings in what was then and still is the U.S. capital city of Washington, though it was in no small part a retaliation for the destruction and looting of what was then the capital of Canada in modern-day Toronto by American troops a year earlier. Notwithstanding the British blow, America's resolve to expand its territory would nevertheless march along before too long, albeit only westward and southward. In what is known as the First Seminole War, 1816 to 1819, America invaded what was then the Spanish Florida on the pretext that the native tribe of Seminoles was complicit in helping to free the black slaves from their white owners. In 1821, in the aftermath of that conflict, the Sunshine State would join the Union after Spain agreed to secession through what came to be called the 1819 Adams-Honest Treaty. However, the Seminoles refused to accept white rule over what they considered to be their homeland for centuries and millennia. In 1835, the resulting standoff would usher in the Second Seminole War, 1835 to 1842, during which the U.S. military upped the ante as it went about relocating Seminoles out of Florida to federal territories in the American Southwest, specifically earmarked for the native tribes. In 1845, what was then the Republic of Texas decided to become integrated into the United States in spite of Mexico laying claim to what is today the Lone Star State. In 1846, America would lock horns with Mexico in an effort to further push its territorial orbit westward through what came to be called the Mexican-American War, 1846 to 1848, a bloody armed conflict during which the United States annexed from Mexico what is today much of American Southwest from Texas to California, and in doing so literally laid the groundwork for the massive territory to be whitewashed through prioritizing white settlements at the expense of ravaging the livelihoods of native tribes and driving them into all but extinction. In 1848, in the aftermath of the Mexican-American War, American sovereignty would stretch from the Pacific Ocean in the west to the Atlantic Ocean in the east, in what is today called the U.S. mainland. Would Canada be the next target after America's territorial expansion southward and westward were effectively complete? As for Canadians, they had never forgotten the destruction of their capital city in 1813, and quite understandably, they not only had their heart in their mouth, but were also convinced that America would soon pay them another visit, even with the mighty British Empire at their disposal. In 1857, out of an abundance of caution, Canada would move its capital city from Toronto to Ottawa, which was not only further out from the American border, but was also better fortified. However, America would soon become embroiled in a socio-political upheaval unfolding at home and would have to put its territorial ambitions on hold, to the much delight of fearful Canadians. Indeed, cracks would soon begin to appear among whites over the inhumane treatment of black people, particularly with regard to the expansion of slavery into the newly conquered territories in the American West. While much of the American North espoused the idea of emancipation of slaves, the American South felt that this was a nothing burger due to what it believed to be the superiority of whites over blacks. And the political stakes of the American South would be further boosted through the intervention of the U.S. Supreme Court. In 1857, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that the black people were not entitled to citizenship because they hailed from an inferior race, and therefore they could not be granted the same privilege as white people. In 1860, Abraham Lincoln was propelled to the nation's highest office as the 16th POTUS, even though he failed to win in any one of more than a dozen slave states in the American South. Being vehemently opposed to slavery, Lincoln's victory appeared to be the final nail in the Union's coffin, as it not only irked the slave states, but also sparked the secession of South Carolina a little more than a month after the 1860 election. In 1861, another 6 slave states, namely Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas, in the order of their secession, would join South Carolina, and together they would form the Confederate States of America as the nation erupted into what arguably remains the bloodiest conflict on American soil in what is called the American Civil War. 1861 to 1865. Although 4 more states, namely Virginia, Arkansas, North Carolina, and Tennessee, joined the Confederacy soon after the outbreak of Civil War in 1861, the Union Army would ultimately emerge victorious and keep the nation united as we know it today. In 1863, Lincoln issued the executive order called Emancipation Proclamation in the midst of the ongoing Civil War to abolish slavery, thereby setting millions of black people free. With the arrival of the 6th Aquanium, 1871 to 1954, the American society had indeed been remade for all intents and purposes, to add to a roster of new institutions having been erected at the expense of old ones, in line with the recurring spell of Oqual cycle. The births of many more nations across the globe, including the likes of what are modern-day nations of Italia, 1861, Japan, 1868, and Germany, 1871, would also join the ranks of what was now a heavyweight America with the arrival of a new Aquanium. Before too long, driven by the then rapidly expanding railroad economy, America would become a manufacturing powerhouse and the largest global economy, surpassing that of Britain just as the 19th century closed out. Admittedly, as promised by an auspicious spell of Oqual cycle, America was not alone but would also be joined by most other nations of the world in savoring those happy times during much of the first half, 1871 to 1912, of the sixth Aquanium, as evidenced by the Gilded Age in America, the late Victorian era in Britain, La Belle Époque in France, and Grundazeit in Germany. During the early 20th century, America was relishing its rapid rise to having become a global power on the back of what was now a powerful military, the largest economy, and a nation feeding the world in that its exports of goods and services far exceeded its imports. However, the outbreak of World War I would put a prompt end to happy times across much of the globe and serve as a harbinger of terrible times to engulf humanity over the next several decades that followed. Nevertheless, the World War I also offered America an opportunity to rub shoulders with the big European boys and test the waters for its own hegemonic ambitions of patrolling the world and controlling its precious resources, with the then dominant British Empire looking increasingly vulnerable to falling apart under its own weight. In particular, witnessing Germany as a rising power threatening to knock Britain off its hegemonic perch, the World War I served as nothing short of a godsend for America to press home its own claim to rising to global hegemony. To achieve that goal, America would play a leading role in crafting the draconian 1919 Treaty of Versailles that would make sure that Germany would never be able to stand on its feet again, thereby leaving the United States as the sole heir to what was then Britain's hegemonic throne. In the event that the 1919 Treaty of Versailles failed to crush Germany, America would also draft during the 1920s and 1930s what came to be called the War Plan Red, a backup plan to directly attack many strategic territories of the British Empire in an effort to knock it off its hegemonic perch should it become necessary. However, the War Plan Red became moot after the 1919 Treaty of Versailles handsomely delivered the goods in having planted a much-anticipated rematch between a resurgent Germany and decadent Britain already on its last leg through World War II. And with that self-destructive conflict unfolding across Eurasia, kilomiles away from American shores, the United States had finally hit a home run without even breaking a sweat. Indeed, the heavy cost of World War II not only reduced much of Europe and the world to ashes, but it also fired up America's economic engine at home to new heights. To say that America fiddled while the globe burned would be a huge understatement. Inevitably, World War II would also bankrupt Britain, as it would be forced to rapidly roll back its colonial empire and hand over the baton of global hegemony to America, just as the Sixth Aquanium, 1871 to 1954, drew to a close. That there was a new sheriff in town was further underscored by the 1944 Bretton Woods Agreement that propelled the American dollar to become the world's new reserve currency at the expense of the British pound, just as the Annus Horribilis 1944 of the Sixth Aquanium rolled around. However, the onset of dollar hegemony in 1944 did not quite hit home, as Britain dared to exercise its hegemonic will once more through what came to be called the 1956 Suez Crisis, When the empire upon which the sun never set tried to regain control of the Suez Canal after it had been nationalized by Egypt, but being left to lick its wounds and having lost its imperial mojo forever due to the intervention of what was now mighty America. Not only did America stand shoulder to shoulder with Egypt during the 1956 Suez Crisis, but it also threatened to offload its bond holdings in sterling with the potential to exacerbate the collapse of the British pound, which had already begun in the aftermath of the 1944 Bretton Woods Agreement. Such a stab in the back would come as a bombshell for Britons, leaving many of them holding their head in their hands as they pondered, with friends like America, who needs enemies? If the 1944 Bretton Woods Agreement had not signaled the end of British hegemony, the 1956 Suez Crisis surely marked the beginning of America's role as the dominant global power that was now single-handedly calling the shots and pulling the levers of geopolitics, just as the current and seventh Aquanium 1955 to 2038 had kicked off. Buoyed by such a hegemonic virtue at its disposal, America would quickly up the ante on imposing what we now know is a dehumanizing, morally corrupted, and environmentally destructive worldview upon the rest of the world, beginning with what came to be known as the Vietnam War, 1955 to 1975. Although that decades-long asinine ploy left America deeply wounded at home and away, its capitalist urge to control and enslave the world never wavered. With the money printer at one's disposal, who would indeed back off from doing exactly that? After taking the dollar off the gold standard in 1971, America would predictably bring its money printer to the fore and simply print its way to self-indulgence, excesses, and imbalances under the guise of capitalism. While other nations worked off their back and by the sweat of their brow, America would enjoy the fruits of their labor in exchange for what one could call nothing more than junk pieces of paper. However, those who exploit and enslave others face the music sooner or later, as every one of America's predecessors did. America would therefore be no exception to following in their footsteps. As the saying goes, those who fail to learn from history are doomed to repeat it. As the Oqual cycle goes, those who pay no heed to the dire spell of its second half are destined to self-destruct themselves as it reaches its crescendo around Annus Horribilis. With the onset of the ominous second half, 1997 to 2038 of the current Aquanium, America would indeed reignite its wounds as it once again began decades-long 9/11 wars to exert its might over the world and its resources, driven by its capitalist propaganda. Alas, the Oqual cycle will have none of that and leave America deeply wounded for its aggression and continuing violation of the laws of nature. Not only did that gambit backfire, but it would also come back to haunt America in that the embers of the 9/11 wars continue to rage to this day, with the nation teetering on the brink of a looming bankruptcy, with the US dollar edging ever closer to losing its global luster a la British pound in 1944 over the next decade or so, coupled with the social and moral decadence at home from soaring public debts through shrinking middle class to faltering infrastructure. In what I call the 9/11 curse, America literally dug its own grave in lieu of using the tragedy to undertake a moment of self-reflection so as to channel much-needed resources toward addressing what were then already becoming a growing plethora of domestic issues, rather than funneling every dollar of a U.S. taxpayer overseas to smash the world into pieces with the sole intention of bloating the coffers of its ruling elite and the wealthy at the expense of the pain and suffering of the masses that we can all see in plain sight today. In fact, the onset of 9/11 wars marked the beginning of the end of American hegemony in the footsteps of his predecessors, just as they also happened to cross the annus terminalis of Oqual cycle. Notably, self-destructive gambits such as the 9/11 wars unfolding around annus terminalis 1997 of the current and 7th Aquanium are renowned for plunging hegemons into an irreparable and irreversible turmoil from which they never seem to recover. Some 84 years before the 9/11 wars, the World War I, 1914 to 1918, marked the beginning of the end of the then hegemon Britain, just as the previous and 6th Aquanium moved past its annus terminalis, 1913. Rewind the clock back by another 84 years, the outbreak of so-called Anglo-Cossey War 1829 to 1833, in sync with the onset of annus terminalis 1829 of a 5th Aquanium between the Cossey Kingdom in what is modern-day northeastern Indian state of Meghalaya and Britain, marked the beginning of decades-long hostilities between the colonialists and natives that would ultimately boil over into the 1857 Indian Mutiny. Though largely suppressed, that widespread and violent rebellion nevertheless bore the potential to topple British hegemony. Some 84 years earlier, the outbreak of so-called Carnatic Wars 1744 to 1763 between the then dominant power of France and the rising power of Britain, almost in tandem with the onset of annus terminalis 1745 of the 4th Aquanium, signaled the beginning of the end of French hegemony. Take the clock back by another 84 years, the outbreaks of the duo of Anglo-Dutch War 1665 to 1667 and the Franco-Dutch War 1672 to 1678, barely years after the onset of annus terminalis 1661 of the 3rd Aquanium, was a reminder that the Dutch hegemony had already peaked, and the decades that followed would indeed send the Netherlands into bewildering wilderness. Some 84 years earlier, the 1581 Declaration of Independence by Netherlands from the shackles of the then hegemon Spain came just after the onset of annus terminalis 1577 of 2nd Aquanium, against the backdrop of the ongoing 80 Years' War 1566 to 1648, and marked the beginning of the end of Spanish hegemony. Rewind back by another 84 years, the 1492 voyage by Christopher Columbus to the New World on behalf of the then rising power of Spain, almost in parallel with the onset of annus terminalis 1493 of the 1st Aquanium, signaled that the golden age of the Portuguese Empire was on its last leg. To say that America is on the road to becoming a shadow of his past over the next decade or so would be to put it mildly. It is noteworthy that the world's principal currency also follows the hegemon in a phenomenon referred to as monetary hegemony. The hegemon is endowed with the privilege of being the de facto head of the international monetary system, such that its currency commands a lion's share of international trade in foreign exchange reserves. Just as British pound was dethroned by US dollar during Annus Horribilis 1944 of the previous Aquanium, Chinese yuan is likewise set to oust the latter sometime between Annus Horribilis 2028 of the current Aquanium and Annus Mirabilis 2039 of the next cycle. Yet, so many fools naively believe that US dollar will continue to be the king in spite of having no clue as to what it takes to continue to be the monetary hegemon. In order to land the privilege of becoming the monetary hegemon and continue to hold that status, a nation must satisfy the following three criteria. 1. Be a manufacturing powerhouse, not only head and shoulders, but also chest and waist above all other nations, such that the world becomes dependent upon the export of that nation's goods and services. Today, that nation is unarguably China. Some 84 years earlier, America was where China is today. In other words, once the world becomes dependent upon your merchandise, it is only a matter of time before you begin to demand that the payment be made in your own currency in lieu of the reserve currency of another nation. Indeed, China is already on that path, and Chinese yuan will heavily cut into the dollar's share of international trade over the next decade or so. 2. Boast a powerful military that can match or surpass that of any other rivals vying to compete with your desire to become the monetary hegemon. A powerful military is de rigueur to defending your currency, lest the nation gets bulldozed by a more powerful force. Some 84 years earlier, it was American military that caught up with the British military and emerged as the dominant force in the aftermath of World War II. Today, it is Chinese military that is not only becoming a headache for America, but it is also set to overtake the U.S. armed forces over the next decade. And 3. Stockpile as much gold as possible so that it can be used as a collateral to lure the world into adopting your currency with the promise of being able to swap the paper notes with a set amount of gold anytime one so desires. Pegging the currency to gold is an old bait-and-switch scheme that has been used time and again to kill rival currencies throughout history, but once everyone gets hooked, the process of taking the paper notes of the gold standard begins in no uncertain terms so as to allow the money printer to go brrrr without any checks and balances. Some 84 years earlier, it was America that began to hoard the yellow metal like an Indian bride, with its gold reserves reaching 20 kilotons by 1940 and overshadowing those of Britain. It was indeed on the back of such massive heaps of gold reserves, coupled with America's military might and its manufacturing prowess, that the dollar became the king in 1944. While America's gold reserves today amount to no more than 10 kilotons, China likely holds at least five-fold as much and possibly even more, given that the Asian giant has not only been the largest miner of the yellow metal, but also the largest gold importer from every corner of the world over the past couple of decades. Not only is China the only nation today that satisfies all three conditions noted above, but America has also made passing the baton of monetary hegemony to the Asian giant all the more easier through weaponizing the dollar in the wake of the ongoing Russia-Ukraine war that began in 2022. In fact, trade sanctions against Russia have jump-started the demand for a new international currency at the expense of the dollar, with the Chinese yuan likely to emerge as the winner for the reasons stated above. Add to that the fact that America has not only been consistently running a trade deficit since the outset of 21st century, but is also rapidly becoming buried under heaps of debt and printed money. Together with a deeply divided and decadent American society having lost its moral compass, these represent signs of a hegemon rapidly collapsing under his own weight and unfit to lead the world. With China being the exact mirror image of the socio-political upheaval facing America today, the time to pass on the baton of global hegemony is indeed inching ever closer with the passing of each year. Pass or not, China only has to showcase its humongous gold vaults to kill the dollar overnight. There is no doubt that the Asian giant is looking to do exactly that when push comes to shove, due for example to reclaiming its long-lost soul Taiwan over the next decade or so. In fact, Chinese bilateral trade with most nations of the world today is already being conducted in CNY, while many other countries are beginning to pivot toward the yuan out of fear of their increasing reliance on USD, with an unpredictable future against the backdrop of Uncle Sam having been diagnosed with an untreatable and a rare form of schizophrenia. Additionally, a growing list of countries such as Russia and Iran have not only started using CNY in international trade, wherein yuan as a form of payment is accepted between any two trading partners outside China, but they are also leading the charge toward de-dollarization through negotiating with other nations to pay in CNY for their commodities and to accept it in return for their exports. That CNY is on an ascending trajectory is further underscored by the fact that its share of global trade has precipitously risen to almost 10% over the past decade, all the while a growing number of central banks around the globe are beginning to empty out their dollar reserves in exchange for yuan. With the yuan rising fast in international trade, China is aptly and deservedly positioned to emerge as the new hegemon, taking up the baton of global leadership from America sometime between Annus Horribilis 2028 of the current Aquanium and Annus Mirabilis 2039 of the next cycle. However, such a transfer of global power is unlikely to happen without a showdown between the two superpowers in a manner akin to the fact that the alpha male in a lion pride does not get dethroned by a younger and more hungrier competitor without putting up a fight of his life. In that sense, the looming World War III can also be viewed as a rite of passage for the newly minted hegemon to take up the mantle from his predecessor. But for China, such a rite of passage goes through Taiwan, for without its soul, the Asian giant cannot claim to be whole, much less a leader of the world. Being fully aware of such a deadly confrontation and coronation waiting on the horizon, China is working round the clock to beef up its military paraphernalia, with the Chinese Navy today being the largest in the world and rapidly dwarfing its U.S. counterpart. A truly daunting feat that should not be lost on anyone given that the wars are won and lost at sea. And when it comes to battling it out at sea, preponderance reigns supreme over all else in guaranteeing the triumph as attested by history time and again. In fact, history shows that the hegemon is often dethroned not because it is no longer powerful enough to knock out its rival, but because it lacks the stamina to go the full round due to the low morale within its ranks, echoing the rather poor state of the nation as a whole, having fallen prey to moral disintegration as a result of self-indulgence and waning zest for life. When China and America finally square up against each other over the next decade or so, it is quite clear which nation would be fighting tooth and nail and which one would be grappling with a low morale. Or rather, which one of them would be fighting to the death and which one fighting for life. Top that up with the fact that China has also begun to salivate at the prospect of shepherding the world in accordance with its national interests as it rapidly expands its radius of geopolitical influence around the globe. That is all the more damning for the Western powers given that the center of economic gravity is set to shift to Asia over the next decade or so after a hiatus of some 500 years. Those who have not already booked a Mandarin class for their golden child, it would pay to move fast while supplies last. And as Americans prepare to kiss their casino dream goodbye, the Sino dream is finally coming home for the Chinese. Section 2.2 Global Politics. Political forces such as globalism, pluralism, populism, nationalism, and fascism do not crop up randomly, but rather appear to be closely intertwined with the spell of Oqual cycle. While positive forces such as globalism and pluralism reign supreme during the first half of Oqual cycle, negative forces powered by nationalism and populism rear their ugly head during the second half. For example, leaders are considered to be on the extreme fringes of politics and being viewed as unelectable or unfit for office, such that they become the butt of jokes during the first half of Oqual cycle, steadily gain popularity with the onset of second half, and then often go on to rewrite a nation's history. Admittedly, the second half 1997 to 2038 of the current and seventh Aquanium has already witnessed a rising wave of divisive and nationalist leaders gaining foothold in countries such as Russia, Vladimir Putin, Turkey, Recep Erdogan, Britain, Nigel Farage, France, Marine Le Pen, China, Xi Jinping, Pakistan, Imran Khan, India, Narendra Modi, America, Donald Trump, Brazil, Jair Bolsonaro, and Italia, Giorgia Meloni. A similar scenario of far-right nationalist leaders springing out across the globe also panned out during the second half, 1913 to 1954, of the previous and sixth Aquanium in nations as far-flung as British India, Muhammad Ali Jinnah, Soviet Union, Joseph Stalin, Italia, Benito Mussolini, Turkey, Mustafa Kemal Atatürk, China, Chiang Kai-shek, and Germany, Adolf Hitler. And you bet, nor were far-right and divisive leaders in short supply during the second half, 1829 to 1870, of the fifth Aquanium. Turkey, Sultan Abdülmecid; France, Emperor Napoleon III; Italia, Giuseppe Garibaldi; America, Jefferson Davis; Russia, Tsar Alexander II; British India, Syed Ahmad Khan; and Germany, Otto von Bismarck. Long story short, the right-wing nationalist or populist tide seemingly oscillates in tandem with the progression of an Oqual cycle, such that it ebbs during the first half and then begins to flow during the second half in what is dubbed the politics aqua cycle. On the other hand, globalism is a mirror image of populism in that it rises during the first half of Oqual cycle and then decays during the second half. What causes the rise of far-right nationalist politics with the onset of the second half of Oqual cycle? The factors driving such divisive propaganda are often a byproduct of grievances and injustices in the society, either driven by the ruling elite at home or due to geopolitics or unfair trade policies imposed by other nations. For their part, the nationalist leaders quickly latch onto such societal shortcomings and exploit them for their own political gains. For example, the draconian treatment of Germany in the aftermath of World War I, as stipulated in the 1919 Treaty of Versailles, crafted by the likes of Britain, France, and America, began almost in tandem with the onset of second half 1913 to 1954 of the previous Aquanium. Not only would it lead to the rapid rise in popularity of nationalist politics across Deutschland, but it would also provoke the masses to propel a madman to their nation's highest office, filled with hate and revenge for the humiliation of his country at the hands of his enemies. Simply put, the cruel and disproportionate punishment handed out to Germany, largely driven by the propaganda to cripple the then fast-rising global power, so much so that it would never be able to stand on its feet again, much less challenge anyone's hegemony ever again, only served to plunge the world into an even deeper crisis with the outbreak of World War II exactly 2 decades later. Shamefully, those who call the shots and pull the levers of international politics somehow always seem to sweep history under the rug due to their own greed and hubris. It should therefore hardly raise eyebrows to learn that the world has once again begun to navigate similar waters to those it encountered some 84 years earlier, with today's socio-political upheaval bearing stunning echoes of the past. In 1999, in an echo of the poor treatment of Germany by the 1919 Treaty of Versailles some 84 years earlier, provocation of Russia by NATO, a close-knit military alliance among 32 Western nations led by the United States, was officially undertaken almost in parallel with the onset of second half of the current Aquanium that in hindsight appears to have been the trigger for the looming World War III. In 2000, NATO's provocation would be met by the rise to power in Russia of Vladimir Putin, a nationalist leader who would make sure that the Siberian tiger would live up to its billing and take the NATO bully by the horns. In fact, NATO has doubled its inertia in an attempt to rub shoulders with Russia's borders since the breakup of USSR in 1991. In so doing, NATO provoked Russia to not only annex Crimea in 2014, but also provided it with fresh tinder to restart the war in Ukraine in 2022. In Einstein's disguise, insanity is doing the same thing over and over again, but expecting a different outcome. If not kept in check, insanity can often lead to self-destruction in a manner akin to a malignant tumor. In the Western world, that should set off alarm bells given that the U.S. foreign policy not only runs on insanity, but also hubris on steroids. It has not only been misfiring on all cylinders for decades, but it will also come back to haunt the West, particularly in the wake of the ongoing Russia-Ukraine war, showing no signs of easing. Let us take a deeper look into the mindset of NATO, driven by the monetary urge to control and subjugate the non-Western world. Subsection titled, NATO is the antithesis of peace. In 1949, NATO was created as a counterweight to keep the imperial ambitions of the former USSR in check during what came to be known as the Cold War between the self-proclaimed free and capitalist America and the West-declared evil and communist Soviet Union. In 1991, the USSR underwent a political apoptosis, yielding 15 independent nations such as the likes of modern-day Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus. With the perceived threat of communism all but having perished in the aftermath of the dissolution of USSR, one would have noted that the days of NATO would also be numbered, as it would quickly become irrelevant and obsolete in a post-Soviet world. Alas, the exact opposite transpired. Rather than welcoming Russia into the fold of Western world, the US and its European vassals doubled down and set about making an enemy out of the Siberian tiger, for a world without a declared enemy would be too peaceful for America in its quest to extend its hegemony over every corner of the world, not to mention that the US military is nothing short of being an industrial complex that generates huge profits for its stakeholders. Like a corporation, the military-industrial complex of the United States, or MyCotus, must continue to grow in order to generate ever more profits, and the bigger the enemy, the greater the profits. Toward this propaganda, America pushed for the expansion of NATO's European footprint eastward during the 1990s, even when the perceived threat of communism was no longer on the menu. By 2004, NATO would end up swallowing not only an array of Eastern European states such as Poland and Hungary that provided a buffer zone between the West and the former USSR, but also 3 former Soviet republics, namely Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, precariously sitting within breathing distance of Moscow. This was all the more alarming given that George Kennan, an architect of the U.S. policy toward the Soviet Union in the post-World War II era that ensured that the Cold War would never turn hot, had warned against the expansion of NATO nearly a decade earlier. In 1997, in an op-ed on NATO's decision to march into Eastern Europe, Kennan observed, "The view, bluntly stated, is that expanding NATO would be the most fateful error of American policy in the entire post-Cold War era. Such a decision may be expected to inflame the nationalistic, anti-Western, and militaristic tendencies in Russian opinion, to have an adverse effect on the development of Russian democracy, to restore the atmosphere of the Cold War to East-West relations, and to impel Russian foreign policy in directions decidedly not to our liking." In 1998, in an op-ed by Thomas Friedman on NATO's appetite for a meteoric expansion, Kennan foretold, "I think it is the beginning of a new Cold War. I think the Russians will gradually react quite adversely, and it will affect their policies. I think it is a tragic mistake. There was no reason for this whatsoever. No one was threatening anybody else. This expansion would make the founding fathers of this country turn over in their graves." In that same 1998 op-ed, Kennan went on to add, "I was particularly bothered by the references to Russia as a country dying to attack Western Europe. Don't people understand? Our differences in the Cold War were with the Soviet communist regime. And now we are turning our backs on the very people who mounted the greatest bloodless revolution in history to remove that Soviet regime. And Russia's democracy is as far advanced, if not farther, as any of these countries we have just signed up to defend from Russia. It shows so little understanding of Russian history and Soviet history. Of course, there is going to be a bad reaction from Russia, and then the West will say that we always told you that is how the Russians are, but this is just wrong." How ironic then that the West is behaving toward Russia today exactly along the lines foreseen by Kennan a quarter of a century earlier. How come the West-Russia relations have hit a nadir despite the fact that the USSR is no more? What triggered the collapse of USSR? Other than the dire economic straits that befell the USSR in the aftermath of the decade-long Soviet-Afghan War, 1979 to 1989, one of the major catalysts for the dissolution of USSR was the assurance given to Russians by the West that NATO would not move an inch eastward in the post-Soviet era. Alas, the naive Russians should have known better that the West never keeps promises, nor did they pay heed to the adage that if you yield an inch, they will take a mile. In 1991, before the collapse of USSR, a distance of at least 1,000 miles separated the NATO front line in Denmark to Russia's northwestern border with Latvia. In 2004, just over a decade after the breakup of USSR, NATO had moved its goalposts eastward all the way to Russia's northwestern border when it struck military alliance with the trio of former Soviet republics of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. Add to this the fact that the number of NATO states has doubled to 32 since the breakup of USSR in 1991. In particular, against the backdrop of the then nascent Ukraine-Russia war, barely months after it broke out in early 2022, NATO upped the ante by extending invitation to Finland and Sweden to join its ranks. While the former Scandinavian nations sitting at the northwestern corner of Siberian Tiger has already been added, the latter is all but ratified. In adding these new outfits to its ranks, NATO has today more than doubled its border with Russia to 1,600 miles. Such an unprecedented provocation and exponential growth of the most powerful military killing machine ever created in the history of mankind is not only an attempt to continue to subjugate the non-Western nations, but it also runs counter to the righteous segment of humanity vying for peace on earth. To say that NATO's metastasis in the post-Soviet era is reminiscent of a malignant tumor threatening to wreak havoc on the body fast and furious would be to put it mildly. Admittedly, Russia is not the only target of NATO, but it also poses threat to every other non-Western nation harboring natural resources such as the Middle Eastern countries, being strategically important such as the likes of Afghanistan and Pakistan, or with the potential to challenge Western supremacy such as the likes of China and India. Each one of the latter two nations accounts for nearly 18% of humanity on Earth, compared to here above 10% for the Western world, with America accounting for a meager 4%. That NATO is out to get you is overwhelmingly supported by earth-shattering data over the past several decades. One only has to look at how NATO bombing decimated Soviet-aligned Federation of Yugoslavia 1999 into pieces barely after the curtain had been lowered under the Soviet Union. Not only did the Yugoslavs adopt communism, but they also shared close cultural and ethnic ties with the Soviets through their Slavic consanguinity. In a manner akin to the dissolution of the USSR, the breakup of Yugoslavia into the likes of modern-day Serbia and Croatia therefore served as the final nail in the coffin of communism in NATO's view, even if it came at a huge cost of butchering humanity. The NATO bombing of Yugoslavia was followed by the utter carnage of the likes of Afghanistan 2001 to 2021 and Iraq 2003 to 2011 by NATO in disguise of America using the 9/11 attacks as a pretext. More recently, the shameful annihilation of Libya 2011 and Syria 2018 after they began to grow a spine rather than submit to the will of Western powers speaks volumes of evil acts committed on the part of NATO. As the Holy Quran asserts, وَإِذَا قِيلَ لَهُمْ لَتُفْسِدُوا فِي الْأَرْضِ قَالُوا إِنَّمَا نَحْنُ مُسْلِمُونَ. When they are told not to fight on earth, they claim that they are in fact the peacemakers. Like the Quranic parable, a seasoned criminal would often claim that their actions are pious and that they never intend to harm anyone when interrogated about their inner motives. When grilled about its hidden propaganda, NATO a la criminal claims that its only purpose is self-defense and maintenance of peace on earth. Simply put, when other nations go to a war, it is because they have evil intentions, but when NATO wages a war, it is for peaceful purposes. Ironically, by its very own admission, albeit in a surreptitious manner, NATO is a criminal enterprise whose goals run counter to peace. Indeed, bombing weaker nations and tearing them apart does not help bring about peace, not to mention that they pose no threat to anyone, much less to the West. Rather, the only threat such weaker nations pose is their failure to put Western interests before their own. In other words, NATO is essentially a state-sponsored mafia that uses force to subjugate the weak and vulnerable so that the West can have the first bite on their precious resources and commodities, with the producers left with the leftovers. As the saying goes, actions speak louder than words. Judging by its actions, the West is far from satisfied with NATO being the sole killing machine at its disposal. Toward that deplorable goal, an offshoot of a NATO named AUKUS, a trilateral nuclear security pact signed between Australia, UK, and US in 2021, has already emerged to specifically deal with the rise of China as it readies to free itself in earnest from the shackles of slavery that it has been subjected to at the hands of Western overlords over the past couple of centuries or so. In West's defense, however, one could understand the rising fear of a non-Western world that together makes up almost 90% of humanity on Earth. Yet its resources and commodities being central to Western appetite of a reckless standard of living that it enjoys at the expense of poor and destitute. Accordingly, the Western think tank likely subscribes to the notion that the best way to deal with such fear is to go on the offensive and enslave those whom you can, lest they enslave you. That school of thought might have held water in the past, but in today's world we can do a lot better than use our might to suppress the weak and vulnerable. To say that NATO is nothing short of being a deadly fox vying to guard the henhouse would be to put it lightly. Indeed, the Russian chickens are not out of the woods yet, as the NATO fox appears to be moving ever closer for what it believes will be the kill of the century. Alas, the NATO fox knows not that it is rather being tricked into the Siberian tiger's den and that it will soon be fighting for its life. Next subsection. NATO is breathing down Russia's neck. Today, NATO sits cunningly so close to Moscow that every time it sneezes, the Russians reportedly catch flu. If such a reckless behavior and utter disregard for Russians does not constitute an act of aggression, then there ain't such a thing as aggression by any stretch of the imagination. In spite of vociferous opposition from Russia in the face of ever rapidly expanding NATO, posing serious security challenges for the successor to the former USSR, America and its European poodles would be far from satisfied with the hidden propaganda of cornering Russia such that it could be easily balkanized or broken up into smaller states. To that end, America and its European allies began to set their sights on wooing Ukraine since as early as 2002. In so doing, Ukraine would be showered with undivided attention and material aid so as to compel it to tie the knot with NATO, for it would mark the death knell for the territorial integrity and survival of Russia. In 2007, the Russian President Putin would tellingly push back on NATO's aggression toward Russia and the world writ large during his address to the annual 43rd Munich Security Conference. In that 2007 speech, Putin noted, "Today we are witnessing an almost uncontained hyper-use of force, military force, in international relations, force that is plunging the world into an abyss of permanent conflicts. As a result, we do not have sufficient strength to find a comprehensive solution to any one of these conflicts. Finding a political settlement also becomes impossible. We are seeing a greater and greater disdain for the basic principles of international law, and independent legal norms are, as a matter of fact, coming increasingly closer to one state's legal system. One state, and of course, first and foremost the United States, has overstepped its national borders in every way. This is visible in the economical, political, cultural, and educational policies it imposes on other nations. Well, who likes this? Who is happy about this? And of course, this is extremely dangerous. It results in the fact that no one feels safe. I want to emphasize this. No one feels safe. Because no one can feel that international law is like a stone wall that will protect them. Of course, such a policy stimulates an arms race. The force's dominance inevitably encourages a number of countries to acquire weapons of mass destruction. Moreover, significantly new threats, though they were also well known before, have appeared, and today threats such as terrorism have taken on a global character. In a reference to NATO in that same 2007 speech, Putin observed, "It turns out that NATO has put its frontline forces on our borders, and we continue to strictly fulfill the treaty obligations and do not react to these actions at all. I think it is obvious that the NATO expansion does not have any relation with the modernization of the alliance itself or with ensuring security in Europe. On the contrary, it represents a serious provocation that reduces the level of mutual trust. And we have the right to ask, against whom is this expansion intended? And what happened to the assurances our Western partners made after the dissolution of the Warsaw Pact? Where are those declarations today? No one even remembers them. But I will allow myself to remind this audience what was said. I would like to quote the speech of NATO General Secretary Mr. Werner in Brussels on 17th May 1990. He said at the time, the fact that we are ready not to place a NATO army outside of German territory gives the Soviet Union a firm security guarantee. Where are those guarantees? In spite of Putin's ominous warning that NATO, having moved its front line right up to Russia's borders, and America's perpetual violation of international law was unacceptable some 15 years ago, the West would nevertheless continue to march along the path of provocation at full throttle, as if it were on cocaine with misguided euphoria showing no signs of abating. In fact, West's crush on Ukraine would become so obsessive that it would even go as far as supporting a coup d'etat to overthrow a democratically elected government of Ukraine in 2014. After its pro-Russian president Viktor Yanukovych rejected an offer of economic aid from the European Union in favor of a deal with Russia and help a pro-Western puppet Petro Poroshenko to come to power so that NATO could finally add Ukraine to its ranks. Alas, led by their talismanic leader Putin, Russia would have none of that, as any attempt by NATO to phagocytose Ukraine and turn it into a bulwark would mark a red line and patience no more for the Russians. Given the threat of humongous NATO looming large over its head and shoulders, with the potential for nuclear missiles to be stationed on Ukrainian soil minutes away from Russian territory, Russia would understandably begin to fight back and go on the offensive for the first time since the breakup of former USSR in 1991. In 2014, within days of pro-Russian Ukrainian President Viktor Yanukovych having been deposed by the US-led coup, Russia would annex the Crimean Peninsula from Ukraine not only out of its concerns for its own security, but also to show that it had teeth to bite back should anyone dare to stare at Ukraine, a nation that not only shares more than 1,000-mile border, but also closer cultural and historic ties with Russia. Add to this the fact that eastern Ukraine bordering Russia is dominated by ethnic Russians who have overwhelmingly continued to favor Ukraine, remaining a part of the Russian sphere of influence rather than move in bed with the alien and unpredictable West. Unsurprisingly then, Ukraine has been far from being a united and monolithic nation since emerging as a sovereign state in the aftermath of the collapse of USSR in 1991. Indeed, Ukraine has hitherto largely existed as a deeply divided and fractured nation, a feat further exacerbated by the poor treatment of its minorities, including in particular the ethnic Russians. Still, despite Russia flexing its muscles vis-à-vis the annexation of Crimea in 2014, NATO would nevertheless continue to cajole Ukraine out of not only utter disregard for its much larger eastern neighbor, but also posing an existential threat to its very existence. In response, Russia began to threaten to go all into Ukraine out of its concerns for its own security, lest NATO backed off from its propaganda. Yet, NATO upped the ante and kept doubling down on its goal to extend its military hegemony over Ukraine. In 2021, Russia would offer a befitting repose to NATO, knocking on its doorstep as it began to amass troops along its western border with Ukraine. With a bargaining chip in one hand and from a position of strength, Russia would now not only require NATO to back off from its backyard, but it would also demand that the following four conditions be honored. 1. Ukraine should remain militarily neutral and bury its ambitions of ever becoming a pawn in NATO's dirty game of chess. 2. NATO membership to the trio of former Soviet republics of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania should be rescinded. Ditto for formerly militarily neutral Eastern European nations such as Poland, Czech Republic, Slovakia, Hungary, Romania, Slovenia, Croatia, Montenegro, Albania, North Macedonia, and Bulgaria that joined NATO after 1997. 3. Although abandoned unilaterally by America in 2019, the 1987 Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty should be reinstated. That treaty required the former USSR and USA to eliminate all of their missiles with a striking range between 500 kilometers to 5,500 kilometers. And 4. Signed in 2015, the Minsk agreements that required Ukraine to grant autonomy to Donbas region in eastern Ukraine should be implemented. While Russia clearly played hardball against the West, it is unlikely that satisfying all of these conditions would have been necessary to offset Putin's appetite for an aggression toward Ukraine. Yet the West refused to yield an inch to Russia's demands, for it may not only keep a much-needed World War III at bay, but it could also invite a long-lasting peace on Earth. Alas, peace is to NATO what sunlight is to a vampire. Admittedly, while the ongoing Russia-Ukraine war may be viewed as an act of aggression on the part of Putin, as drummed up by the Western media due to their personal biases, it is in essence a brainchild of NATO either directly or as a byproduct of its perpetual warmongering behavior toward Russia, even in a post-Soviet era. However, NATO's pivot to take such an aggressive step toward Russia will backfire with a vengeance, as it has all but invited World War III onto its doorstep. That does not bode well for humanity writ large. Nor does it conceal the throttle bottom that the Ukrainian leader Volodymyr Zelensky has turned out to be since his rise to power in 2019. Either poorly informed or perhaps merely driven by the greed for the perceived albeit tainted riches that the Western nations enjoy, Zelensky would have been well advised that smaller nations live at the mercy of their giant neighbors who set the political tone and order around them. Thus, Zelensky's push to have Ukraine join NATO would have been equivalent to Canada or Mexico striking a military alliance with the likes of superpowers such as Russia or China. Can one imagine Chinese missiles arriving on Canadian or Mexican soil? What would America's response be? If one believes it would be anything other than U.S. military launching an outright invasion of Canada or Mexico, then they are advised to review a quick primer on the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis. If America would not allow Russian missiles in Cuba, then why Russia should be okay with the potential for NATO's missiles to be stationed in Ukraine in the not-too-distant future? As for Zelensky having turned himself into a Western puppet and being exploited to do the bidding on behalf of NATO, he should have paid heed to the adage, what is good for the goose is good for the gander. Next subsection. NATO is the goose that lays the golden eggs. Like the proverbial goose that lays the golden eggs, killing NATO would be equivalent to killing Mycotus, a hugely profitable enterprise for its stakeholders. With a 20/20 hindsight, one wonders what if NATO had been dismantled in parallel with the dissolution of the former USSR in 1991. Under that scenario, few would doubt that Ukraine would be enjoying warmer relations with both the West and Russia today rather than fighting tooth and nail for its survival. In fact, the breakup of NATO would have also brought Russia closer to the West on both economic and military fronts, thereby altogether eliminating the risk of any geopolitical chasm developing between the two superpowers with the potential to turn our planet into ashes like never before. Instead, NATO would march along unhindered in its quest to becoming an 800-pound gorilla so as to kill and annihilate anyone who would dare challenge the Western supremacy over other nations of the world. Did I not proclaim earlier that NATO was a goose? How then does NATO all of a sudden become a gorilla? Like Einstein's theory of wave-particle duality, NATO also exhibits goose-gorilla duality depending on the context. For its stakeholders and friends, NATO is the goose that lays the golden eggs. For its foes and enemies, NATO is the gorilla that sets about crushing them to pieces. As the saying goes, if you cannot beat them, join them. With that in mind, the young Putin would indeed express his interest in having Russia join NATO as soon as he took the helm in 2000, a truly humble undertaking for an alpha-squared male. In 2000, when asked about his views on NATO being a friend or foe in a BBC interview, Putin reflected, "Russia is a part of the European culture. And I cannot imagine my own country in isolation from Europe and what we often call the civilized world. So it is hard for me to visualize NATO as an enemy. I think even posing the question this way will not do any good to Russia or the world. The very question is capable of causing damage. Russia strives for equitable and candid relations with its partners. The main problem here lies in attempts to discord previously agreed common instruments, mainly in resolving issues of international security. We are open to equitable cooperation, to partnership. We believe we can talk about more profound integration with the NATO, but only if Russia is regarded as being an equal partner. You are aware we have been constantly voicing our opposition to NATO's eastward expansion." In that same BBC interview, when quizzed whether Russia could possibly join NATO, Putin added, "I don't see why not. I would not rule out such a possibility. But I repeat, if and when Russia's views are taken into account as those of an equal partner. I want to stress this again and again. The situation that was laid down in the founding principles of the United Nations, that was the situation that was agreed upon in the world at the end of World War II. All right, the situation may have changed. Let's assume there is a desire on the part of those who perceive the change to install new mechanisms of ensuring international security. But pretending or proceeding from the assumption that Russia has nothing to do with it and trying to exclude it from this process is hardly feasible. And when we talk about our opposition to NATO's expansion, mind you, we have never ever declared any region of the world a zone of our special interests. I prefer to talk about a strategic partnership, Its attempts to exclude us from the process is what causes opposition and concern on our part. But that does not mean we are going to shut ourselves off from the rest of the world. Isolationism is not an option. However, Putin's apparently sincere intentions for peace, coupled with his desire to have Russia become fully integrated into Europe, were not only ridiculed, but also swept under the rug by Western leaders. After all, peace is bad for those with vested interests in developing ever more destructive killing machines and with the urge to shepherd the world according to what they see fit. Ironically, such a jingoistic propaganda of NATO has pushed Russia into China's orbit, thereby gifting the latter a strategic partner in its quest to challenge the Western supremacy. Simply put, the China-Russia alliance has not only been fueled by the West, but it also represents a self-inflicted wound. Perhaps Mycotus would beg to disagree, as it would reassure its stakeholders that the bigger the enemy, the greater the financial reward. Indeed, the rapidly growing China-Russia alliance is a boon for Mycotus. Without such a powerful foe to lock horns with, Mycotus would struggle to metastasize at a breakneck pace in awe of leukemia to the tune of an ever-increasing budget, rapidly approaching the $1 trillion a year milestone. In his farewell address to the nation in 1961, the then 34th POTUS Dwight Eisenhower prophesied that without proper checks and balances, Mycotus could one day endanger peace and liberty on Earth. However, Eisenhower's warning fell on deaf ears of the U.S. leaders that have followed him since, though one could argue that they merely symbolize nothing more than a figurehead under the thumb of the deep state. In particular, during the tenure of the 40th POTUS Ronald Reagan, 1981 to 1989, Mycotus more than doubled its inertia even when no hot war was being fought. In a speech delivered to evangelicals at the height of the Cold War in 1983, Reagan alluded to the former Soviet Union as the evil empire, in a reference to what he perceived as a lack of liberty for those living under the Eurasian Federation, as well as his hunger for nuclear proliferation. No one should have been fooled by Reagan's rhetoric back then, nor should anyone today be foolish enough to buy into the absurdity that America has a monopoly over liberty. If anything, Mycotus jeopardizes a little liberty that Americans have here at home and others across the globe. Indeed, Reagan was using the Soviet Union as a smokescreen to shield the very evil being minted under his own command. Although Eisenhower's prophecy has been fully realized today, he would have rather wished that it did not, as he finds himself rolling over in his grave. I should declare that I was not in attendance at Eisenhower's farewell address. His dire warning rather remains a matter of a historical record. Nevertheless, on the basis of barbaric crimes committed against humanity over the past several decades, a neutral observer would be inclined to conclude that although NATO was conceived as a North Atlantic Treaty Organization in 1949, it has today unequivocally morphed into North Atlantic Terrorist Organization, thanks to Mycotus being its biggest sponsor and beneficiary. While NATO may be driven by the conviction that it is too big to fail as it begins to salivate for a mouth-watering showdown to make a killing through the looming World War III, it is exactly such a hubris that plans the downfall of giants. Given that hegemonic wars are renowned for making and breaking of alliances, the odds of NATO becoming dismembered over the next decade or so in the midst of World War III or in the postbellum era are statistically high. This could particularly bear fruition when it finally dawns upon European nations that their dependence on Russia and China for the supply of precious commodities and dirt cheap goods is far more important to the well-being of their masses than continuing to be a party to a military alliance that only benefits their master on the other side of the Atlantic. One might argue that the Western values shared between Europe and America are far too important of a socio-political asset to drive a wedge between such a decades-old alliance. Alas, money matters and blood batters. Even two brothers would be willing to go to war when, for instance, they find themselves at loggerheads over the equitable division of an inherited property. Their blood ties and shared values no longer count. In fact, history has shown time and again that the odds of animosity rather than friendship becoming a default setting are directly proportional to the degree of shared cultural and consanguineous ties between two parties. In other words, Europe and America ought to be enemies rather than friends given their close cultural and blood ties. Their decades-old friendship is nothing more than an anomaly in the bigger scheme of things. Admittedly, some of the worst wars and conflicts over the centuries have been waged between brotherly nations and often driven by their monarchs with a direct line of blood between them. History is indeed not only oscillatory but also a laboratory full of knowledge and wisdom that we can only disregard at our own peril. Section 2.3 Global Reset. Given that the world has been mired in a socio-political upheaval over the past quarter of a century, from living beyond means through institutional fraud run amok to the hilt to debilitating economic stagnation that continue to bloat by the day, only fools would think that such calamities will somehow disappear and a better tomorrow will emerge by itself. Unfortunately, such a societal reboot does not occur spontaneously, but rather it happens to be an endothermic process. In a manner that an endothermic reaction requires the input of heat so as to lower the activation energy of the transition state to generate a product, a destructive mechanism with the potential to strike fear and chaos into the hearts and minds of people on an apocalyptic scale seems to be a prerequisite to rid our society of such a baggage of evils so as to make way for a fresh start. Just as World War II accomplished that goal some 84 years ago, so will World War III over the next decade as utter fear and chaos engulf our society, and in doing so, purge humanity of mischief so as to enable it to come to its senses once more. A brighter tomorrow is indeed on the cards, but only after humanity has been handed due retribution for having gone bonkers over the past several decades. Once a few cities have been nuked into the ground, hardly anyone would indeed be left with the urge to continue a reckless lifestyle of self-indulgence and hedonism, nor would anyone dare to put up a Ponzi over the several decades that follow until people's memories of hard times begin to fade away once more. It is noteworthy that fools have been debating World War III ad nauseum since the outbreak of 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis. Alas, they are utterly ignorant of history in that the odds of a global conflict dwindle as a human society walks past annus horribilis of Oqual cycle as it did some 84 years earlier in 1944, but then they begin to swindle as it cycles back to that horrible year, as is the case today with the next annus horribilis, 2028, barely years away. Simply put, the odds of a full-fledged global conflict breaking out ebb and flow in tandem with the progression of Oqual cycle as exquisitely captured by the Apocalypse Aqua cycle. Since the birth of modern age in 1451, the world has indeed borne testament to deadly conflicts and civil wars breaking out across the globe in the vicinity of annus horribilis each time the Oqual cycle approached its closing stages. with the next annus horribilis barely years away as the current Aquanium 1955 to 2038 draws to a close, the world is once again teetering on the verge of navigating another hell on earth to which our civilization has become accustomed to, in that it returns to our shores once every 84 years on average. Today, there is indeed no going back, as the socio-political upheaval that has been gathering momentum with the passing of each year since the outset of 21st century has already crossed the Rubicon. The question is not whether such a socio-political crisis will bring about World War III, but whether it will make World War II look tame by comparison. While we are inching ever closer to our rendezvous with the destiny, just as we did some 84 years earlier during the 1940s, the end of the current Aquanium is far from nigh, as the looming global conflict could linger well deep into the 2030s. Still, lessons from the past are aplenty as to what we can expect over the next decade or so. A spate of perpetual conflicts from America's decades-long self-destructive 9/11 wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, through civil wars in Syria and Libya, to Russian-Ukrainian war during the second half 1997 to 2038 of the current and seventh Aquanium, has already laid the foundation for the outbreak of World War III in the near future, so as to put an end to the ongoing societal madness with the arrival of a new dawn of hope and prosperity in about a decade or so. A similar drama also unfolded during the second half 1913 to 1954 of the previous and sixth Aquanium, beginning with the outbreak of World War I that was then followed by a series of other conflicts around the globe that would ultimately culminate with World War II as the Oqual cycle drew to a close and ushered in a new dawn across the globe during the 1950s. Likewise, the second half 1829 to 1870 of the fifth Aquanium was also bedeviled by numerous conflicts, beginning with the Second Seminole War, followed by the Mexican-American War, and ending with the American Civil War as the Oqual cycle petered out and heralded a new dawn on American soil during the 1870s. As the fifth Aquanium, 1787 to 1870, bid farewell, new dawns were also witnessed across much of the globe, courtesy of conflicts such as the European revolutions, the Crimean War fought between Russia and the Ottoman Empire, with the latter aided by European powers, and the 1857 Indian Mutiny against the British colonialists. In particular, the European revolutions 1848 to 1849 laid the foundations for the birth of modern-day nations such as Italy 1861 and Germany 1871, just as the sixth Aquanium kicked off. Long story short, the looming World War III is not only unavoidable, but it is also lurking on the horizon and daring to administer an antidote to neutralize humanity's excesses and imbalances amassed over the past several decades. What could trigger the outbreak of World War III in earnest? Are there any parallels to draw from World War II? Subsection titled, Today's socio-political landscape bears stunning echoes of the second half of previous Aquanium. While World War II may have come to Europe in 1939 with Hitler's invasion of Poland, its roots can however be traced back to the early 1930s. In 1931, driven by the greed for raw materials to feed what was then its growing empire, Imperial Japan intentionally detonated a dynamite near a Japanese-owned railway track in what was then known as Manchuria in northeastern China. After leveling the charge against the Chinese dissidents for the dynamite explosion and using it as a pretext, the Japanese military invaded Manchuria and established a colonial outpost. The resulting occupation of a Chinese region by Japan marked the beginning of a perpetual period of hostilities and skirmishes between the two Asian neighbors that is viewed by some as the initial outbreak of World War II in 1931. With Hitler coming to power in Nazi Germany in 1933, Japan not only found a perfect cheerleader to advance its colonial ambitions, but World War II also quickly began to gain inertia across Eurasia. By the time the World War II officially ended in 1945, more than 14 years had elapsed since the false flag operation was staged in Manchuria by the Japanese military in 1931. Today, the global crisis unfolding in plain sight bears many parallels to the onset of World War II. In 2014, Russia annexed the Crimean Peninsula in a manner reminiscent of a Japanese occupation of Manchuria in 1931. The two events bifurcated by just under 84 years. In 2017, Trump took the helm in America in an echo of Hitler's rise to power in Nazi Germany in 1933, the two events falling apart exactly 84 years. While a deranged and wicked soul a la Hitler only emerges once in a millennium, Trump nevertheless shares many parallels with the Nazi madman in that he also upholds extremist ideologies from bigotry and xenophobia through populism and nationalism to his disdain for the rule of law. In 2019, Modi not only stripped the UN-declared disputed territory of Indian-controlled Kashmir of its autonomy and statehood that had been granted to it by the Indian Constitution since 1948, but also heavily remilitarized it so as to fully integrate it into India unilaterally without any regard for international law. Such a deeply controversial move by Modi bore stunning echoes of Hitler's gambit to remilitarize the Rhineland in 1936, just a little over 84 years earlier, in utter violation of the 1919 Treaty of Versailles. That treaty, signed in the aftermath of World War I, required Deutschland to keep its military out of its Rhineland region, comprised of modern-day states of Rhineland-Palatinate, North Rhine-Westphalia, and Hesse in western Germany, and bordering France, Luxembourg, Belgium, and Netherlands, so that it would act as a buffer zone and allay fears of another conflict breaking out. In 1935, Hitler enacted the so-called Nuremberg Laws, a roster of deeply anti-Semitic laws that institutionalized the discrimination and persecution of Jewish people, including the confiscation of their properties and stripping them of their civic rights, as well as the right to German citizenship. In 2019, Modi followed in the footsteps of Nazi madmen and signed into the law the deeply anti-Muslim bill called the Citizenship Act exactly 84 years later in an echo of Nuremberg laws that would grant Indian citizenship to migrants from the trio of Afghanistan, Bangladesh, and Pakistan, provided that they are non-Muslims. A spitting image of his buddy Trump, India's Abormanic leader Rowdy Modi no doubt embraces an ultra-nationalist propaganda coupled with his extreme disdain and marginalization of India's 220 million Muslims, who together would make up the seventh largest nation on the planet. In the context of Oqual cycle, 2023 marks the same time point in the current Aquanium as it did in 1939, exactly 84 years earlier in the previous Aquanium, in a manner similar to the fact that the month of January bears many echoes of his predecessor from the previous year. Accordingly, a scenario similar to what happened during the 1940s awaits us over the next decade or so. Given that World War II did not begin in earnest until 1939, it seems that another global conflict is about to get underway once again. Admittedly, a number of recognizable issues from Putin's Greater Russia through Trump's Make America Great Again to Rowdy Modi's Hinduization of India have already fallen as they did some 84 years earlier prior to the onset of World War II. If World War II began with Japan's invasion of Manchuria in 1931, then World War III began some 84 years later with Russia's invasion of Crimea in 2014. If World War II began with Germany's invasion of Poland in 1939, then World War III has also begun some 84 years later with Russia's full-fledged invasion of Ukraine in 2022. Admittedly, the echoes of 1939 have once again begun to reverberate, with the 2022 Ukraine-Russia war showing no signs of abating. Just as Nazi Germany and Soviet Union signed a pact to divide Poland between them in 1939, so did Russia and China some 84 years later in 2022 to go about their territorial business with a mutual understanding and cooperation in their attempt to reclaim what they believe to be their destiny in Ukraine and Taiwan respectively. With a 2020 hindsight, in a decade from now, the ongoing Ukraine-Russia conflict will come to be viewed as the start of World War III. What could be the next shoe to fall so as to herald the beginning in earnest of World War III in a manner akin to Hitler's invasion of Poland in 1939? Next subsection. Persistent economic stagnation serves as a potent catalyst for triggering global conflicts. History has shown time and again that a sustained economic stagnation serves as a budding ground for regional and global conflicts. With a growing number of nations spearheaded by the likes of United States and European Union mired in mountains of debt and on the precipice of going underwater, the dire economic plight of the masses across much of the globe does not bode well over the foreseeable future. Over the next several years leading up to Annus Horribilis 2028 of the current Equanium, such ongoing economic upheaval will likely plunge the world into a deep depression, leaving billions across the globe without work and unable to put food on the table, in an echo of what the world experienced during the 1930s. That, in turn, could significantly destabilize the world, with the major powers not only blaming each other for the lingering catastrophe, but also using their sticks wherever they can to advance their propaganda, driven in no small part by the greed and hunger for the control of the world's finite resources. With such a tinderbox rapidly bloating, all that will be missing is a spark to put it on fire so as to mark the beginning of a full-fledged global conflict. With the dark clouds of depression thundering to burst and inundate even higher grounds, many world leaders will lose their head and engage in irrational decision-making as a last resort to avert their Titanic from sinking, but with the potential to ignite a global conflict. One such precedent is illustrated by the irrational invasion of too-big-to-be-conquered USSR by Nazi Germany in 1941. A deeply asinine act that cost Hitler not only the war, but also eroded any hope of minimizing the collateral fallout from what was up till then a regional conflict. Had Hitler not invaded the USSR, that European showdown may not have turned into a full-fledged global conflict, much less come to be known as World War II. Why did Hitler commit such a suicidal act? Under an economic depression, even the best of minds begin to act like the rest of minds. Although deeply misplaced, Hitler sensed insecurity and feared that Britain and Soviet Union were secretly hatching a gambit to attack Germany after it had conquered so much across Europe by 1941, from Poland to France, and refused to go cold turkey, or withdraw immediately from the occupied territories. In actuality, not only was there a deep mistrust between Britain and Soviet Union, but they were also far from being in bed with each other, much less planning to tie the knot. Admittedly, a few years before, while Nazi Germany signed various strategic and economic pacts with the USSR in 1939 so as not to stick their nose into each other's territorial ambitions, Britain rejected the Soviet proposal for a tripartite military alliance with France. In return, the USSR refused to not only cooperate with Britain as the war wore on by 1941, but had no interest whatsoever to intervene in the growing conflict largely orchestrated by Hitler up till that point. In particular, Hitler feared that while he would not be able to simultaneously take on United Kingdom and USSR on the Western and Eastern fronts respectively, his military was nevertheless powerful enough to quickly defeat the Soviets so as to put them out of the warring Colosseum before taking on the mighty British in a one-on-one showdown come 1942, with France having already fallen to Nazi Germany in 1940. Alas, the USSR would prove too big to be conquered. What was planned to be a military excursion to be over in a couple of months in what came to be known as the 1941 Operation Barbarossa ultimately bogged down the Nazi army for years in an alien land with not only frigid nights but also no boundaries to overpower. Oftentimes, the Nazi soldiers simply died of bitter cold and deadly hunger due to the lack of provision of sufficient supplies in the inhospitable wilderness and gargantuan landmass of USSR. When they kept the cold and hunger at bay, Stalin's Red Army would lay a trap to their advancing ambitions. To say that the mindless invasion of the USSR by Nazi Germany amounted to an act of martial suicide would be something of a huge understatement. Had Hitler not invaded the USSR, the world would have likely followed a very different trajectory, a diametric opposite of what it did some 84 years ago. It would also be reasonable to conclude that had the world not been under the spell of the Great Depression during the 1930s, not only Hitler's Soviet blunder, but even World War II could have altogether been averted. According to Murphy's Law, anything that can go wrong will go wrong. While that law remains deeply controversial, few doubt that its validity is best demonstrated during times of crisis and an economic depression that almost always befall humanity during Oqual winters as the Oqual cycle draws to a close. Today, being in the midst of Oqual winter 2018 to 2038 of the current Aquanium, it indeed seems that anything that can go wrong is going wrong. Yet, this is just the tip of the iceberg. With the NATO literally fighting Russia through a proxy war in that the Ukrainian resistance against the Siberian tiger is largely fueled by an ever-growing military paraphernalia and technical know-how arriving from the United States and European Union, it is only a matter of time before the ongoing Russia-Ukraine war tailspins into a wider global conflict. Simply put, the decades-long provocation of Russia by NATO has now finally morphed into a direct conflict, though it is still being kept under wraps from the scrutiny of the public at large. Such a stupiditious move by NATO amounts to nothing short of a casus belli, with the ball now being in Russia's court, though the Siberian tiger is unlikely to retaliate back instinctively, but rather at the time of his own choosing, just when it sees an opening on the American front. One such mouth-watering opening could arrive as early as 2024. with Trump being the favorite to take on the aging and inept clown currently occupying the White House in the 2024 U.S. presidential election, the scene is indeed set for the American society to plunge into a civil war at a time that would be perfectly in line with what the Oqual gods have in mind, in that 2024 would be literally knocking on the door of a biennial ceremony in 2029 of the outbreak of American Civil War. With neither Trump nor Biden likely to knock each other out in a decisive manner due to the fact that they would both be running on their partisan propaganda rather than what is best for America, the odds of the 2024 U.S. presidential election producing no clear winner are therefore extremely high. That Americans would be presented with a choice between two aging devils to lead the nation is yet another sign of how low the country has hit. Surely America is not without its angels, but such great souls have a clear heart not to even think about heading the mob rule, not to mention that their character would be assassinated by money and politics even before they were to face public scrutiny. Indeed, no decent human being would ever run for a public office, and those who do so are motivated by their propaganda rather than public service. What will happen if there's no clear presidential winner in 2024? With the results likely to be too close to call in some states, even the election authorities may refuse to declare a winner, at least in a timely manner. Even if they do declare an outright winner, there would be no respite for the American society at large. If Biden is declared a winner, Trump and his army would declare war on America. If Trump wins, Biden's army will likely refuse to accept the outcome. Either way, America is doomed come 2024, even in the absence of an outright civil war breaking out. And it could get a lot worse given that the Oqual winters are renowned for elevating Murphy's Law to a divine status, in that if anything can go wrong, it will definitely go wrong during such calamitous times. Given that we are already in the midst of Oqual winter of the current Aquanium, it would be perfectly in line with the unforgiving spell of Oqual cycle to pull off the unthinkable twist beyond our wildest imaginations. Trump winning the 2024 U.S. presidential election while he's locked up in prison after finally having been convicted for his criminal past. How does this help Russia? The monumental collapse of American society that once prided itself on democracy and freedom would be a godsend for not only Russia to finally square up against the NATO bully, but China would also become emboldened to finally make a move to reunite with its long-lost soul Taiwan against the backdrop of the United States fighting for its survival at home and with a little public support to become embroiled in fighting others' wars. Not that America will step back by any stretch of the imagination, but the low morale of U.S. armed forces will only play into the hands of its enemies trying to undercut its global hegemony. In fact, the Russia-Ukraine war has not only incentivized the Asian giant to finally tie the knot with the Siberian tiger, but it is also a godsend for China in that it has enabled it to 1. Gobble up precious Russian commodities for pennies on the dollar, to fire up its manufacturing engine like never before thanks to Western sanctions against the Siberian tiger and driven by the urgency to rapidly expand its military paraphernalia with a global conflict lurking on the horizon. 2. Pursue closer military alliance with Russia in order to end American hegemony that looked like an impossible goal prior to the outbreak of Ukraine war. And 3. Exploit the Ukraine war as a smokescreen to launch its own invasion of Taiwan and its long-stated goal of reuniting the renegade island with the motherland. With a common adversary and shared goals, the alliance between Russia and China will indeed hit new heights as they begin to cooperate on every front to kick America out of Asia through what will enter the annals of history as World War III. Next subsection. America's ailing manufacturing will become its Achilles heel as World War III breaks out over the next decade. While the use of force to resolve the Taiwan issue might have been unthinkable at the outset of the 21st century, China's military paraphernalia today is not to be underestimated, with the Chinese Navy now being the largest in the world and rapidly dwarfing its U.S. counterpart. A truly daunting feat that should not be lost on anyone given that the wars are won and lost at sea. And when it comes to battling it out at sea, preponderance reigns supreme over all else in guaranteeing the triumph as attested by history time and again. To say that a nation's military is only as good as the strength of its manufacturing would be a huge understatement. Although there is no doubt that America's military arsenal is technically more advanced than that of the Chinese, technological superiority is, however, only one of many facets of the overall strength of a nation's armed forces. While China may not match America in terms of its superiority, the Asian giant nevertheless reigns supreme in its ability to quickly replace its bazookas and in relatively large numbers. The single most important factor in determining the outcome of a war in accordance with history. In marked contrast, America's ability to replenish its ammunition is only as good as its ailing manufacturing that has been in decline for decades thanks to its ever-growing dependence on the supply of dirt cheap goods and services from other nations, with China leading the charge. Tellingly, America and NATO will likely run out of weapons to fight against the combined forces of China and Russia, which between them have everything that one needs to win a large-scale protracted war, with the latter being not only the breadbasket but also an infinite reservoir of raw materials, and the former renowned for its unparalleled production capacity. Not only that, but China will also choke its enemies as it prioritizes its manufacturing powerhouse to serve the needs of its armed forces fighting the war, rather than feeding civilians across America and Europe, to which the latter have become accustomed to and heavily dependent upon. With the spigot of goods and services being turned off, America and Europe will likely plunge into an economic depression with the few goods and services available to keep the masses quiet at home, not to mention that the cost of what little is available will go through the roof. Inflation is indeed an inevitable outcome of global conflicts, as the familiar supply chains and workhorses that have been taken for granted for decades are finally either cut off or diverted away. With a rapidly bloating military at its disposal thanks to its unparalleled manufacturing prowess, China has indeed begun to not only saber-rattle in recent years, but has also upped the ante on reunification with Taiwan by any means possible by 2030 or thereabout. While America may have been buoyed when it came to defending the likes of Kuwait against the whipping boys of Iraq during the Gulf War 1990 to 1991, defending Taiwan will be a whole different ballgame. Not that America cannot play the hardball, but the potential for collateral damage of epic proportions will mean that cooler heads will prevail and an all-out war with China may fail to materialize in Asian waters. Still, reunification of China with Taiwan bears the potential to mark the end of America's role in Asia to the delight of its eternal foes such as Iran and Russia. History holds a glaring lesson for the waxing and waning of hegemons. For example, it was the loss of Suez Canal to Egypt in 1956 that marked a watershed moment in the rapid disintegration of the empire upon which the sun once never set. In the aftermath of the botched and bungled plan that came to be known as the 1956 Suez Crisis, the British Empire was left to not only lick its wounds, but it also lost its mojo forever. Today, with the dark clouds of another global conflict hanging over its shoulders, America is poised to follow in the footsteps that the British Empire took in the bygone century. Fearing the humiliation that the British Empire tasted in 1956, coupled with its prestige being tarnished forever, America will undoubtedly take some sort of stand against China in the event of an invasion of Taiwan, even if that involves using its proxies scattered across large swaths of Asia. Being China's arch-rival along with a close military alliance with America, India may not only begin to confidently salivate, but it may also be assured by the Pentagon of an opportunity of a lifetime to grab disputed lands and territories along its eastern border with the Asian giant, while the latter is preoccupied on its own eastern front to contend the fallout from the invasion of Taiwan. They say that friends in need are friends indeed. To prove that point, Pakistan's powerful and battle-hardened military will stand with China rather than stand back, and could in turn attack India along its northwestern border, thereby not only saber-rattling to slice the Indian Kashmir, but also marching in lockstep with the threat of tearing apart the Asian diamond where it hurts most. In the breakaway regions with the deep-rooted separatist movements such as Khalistan brewing in the Indian Punjab. Such a cunning ploy used by Pakistan may not only outfox the Indian territory, but it will also foil and thwart India's land-grabbing plan crafted to divert a Chinese hold on Taiwan on the other side of the conflict in the Chinese Sea. The India-Pakistan confrontation bears the potential to shepherd the conflict from the Chinese Sea to the Arabian Sea at the mouth of the Persian Gulf, home to mortal enemies such as Iran and Saudi Arabia, with the potential for something to misfire in the vicinity of the deadly war-prone Strait of Hormuz. In particular, against the backdrop of the rapidly expanding conflict in Asia, Iran will likely forge an alliance with Pakistan to further bolster the China-Russia axis and fancy its chances to kick what it perceives to be the American devil out of what it sees as not only its Mecca but also Jerusalem. Cheered on by a cacophony of death to America by its people, the Iranian regime will feel that the time to write its destiny has finally arrived on its shores. With Iran having entered the war, it may not be long before Israel joins America in NATO out of its own grievances against the Islamic Republic, having threatened to wipe the Jewish state off the face of earth for decades. While retaliating to an Iranian aggression or exploiting the mayhem, America will go ballistic and unleash its deadly firepower to take out the Ayatollahs that it has been trying to do so since 1979, thereby settling old scores. Alas, America has a terrible record of settling older scores, as is evident from the unethical and immoral war masterminded in the aftermath of 9/11 attacks to take out Iraq after failing to do so during the Gulf War a decade earlier. Importantly, America's intervention will also serve to castigate China directly and push it back, or at least let China know who the reigning champion is. A direct confrontation with China will almost certainly draw the likes of Japan and South Korea into the conflict due to their own grievances with the Asian giant, with the potential for the conflict to spill over into other regions of the globe. In particular, North Korea will align itself with the China-Russia axis and square up to neutralize any threat posed by South Korea and the U.S. forces operating from the Korean Peninsula. Unlike its predecessors some 84 years earlier, the odds of World War III coming to America's doorstep are however extremely high, given the long-range hypersonic missiles at the disposal of his enemies. Not only that, but World War III also bears the potential to turn nuclear. Admittedly, the global conflict straddling the annus horribilis has always outshined its predecessor due to the emergence of ever more destructive killing machines over the course of Oqual cycle. Nor do world leaders shy away from using the most lethal weapon at their disposal as they lock horns to settle the contest for the control of the world and its resources. Since the dawn of the current Aquanium, global powers have hitherto funneled trillions of dollars toward developing a paraphernalia of nukes in order to gain a military edge over their rivals. To believe that such apocalyptic weapons are only for the showroom would be to sweep history under the rug. In the 16th century, the cannon took the honors for being the most deadly weapon. In the 17th century, it was the musket that would prove more deadly than anything ever invented before. In the 18th century, the rifle would replace the musket. In the 19th century, the machine gun was introduced to kill on a scale like never before. In the 20th century, the likes of bomber aircraft, the ballistic missile, and the nuclear bomb became flying ammunitions that would inflict deaths on a gargantuan scale. In the 21st century, Homo insapiens, or fools, are salivating at the prospect of testing each other's resolve with nukes. On the other side of the bedlam after the nuclear dust has settled in about a decade or so in the postbellum era, China will emerge as the most powerful nation through not only being reunified with Taiwan, but also being crowned the world's new hegemon. The Korean peninsula will also likely undergo reunification to the delight of the world community. On the Indian peninsula, the Kashmir Valley will likely be handed over to Pakistan in exchange for calling an end to all disputes, thereby ushering in the beginning of a new dawn of friendship between the two consanguineous nations. Russia will emerge as an even bigger giant through the annexation of new territories running along its southwestern border and a born-again global power a la Soviet Union with a huge geopolitical influence. As for America, it will be left to lick its wounds as it packs its bags and curtails its military excursions in Asian waters to the foremost delight of American taxpayer. An end to America's unchallenged hegemony would imply that it can finally begin to build its own infrastructure at home rather than continuing to squander its energy and resources and smashing up the world into pieces in a futile cycle. Like much of the globe elsewhere, Americans would finally wake up to a new and brighter dawn, even though US dollar would have lost the prestige of being the dominant world currency as it begins to be overshadowed by the rapidly growing influence of Chinese yuan in international trade sometime during the 2030s, just in time for the arrival of a new Aquanium in 2039. Voilà la guerre mondiale 3. All told, the World War III over the next decade or so will usher in a global reset in that the astronomical havoc unleashed upon our world will serve as a catalyst to create megatons of new jobs as well as replace the old and degenerate system with new technologies. Many nations will undergo rebirth or at least feel that they have been born again. The borders of so many nations will be redrawn as territorial disputes are resolved for the most part, though the Israel-Palestine conflict will likely linger on until the onset of the Oqual winter of the next Aquanium, 2039 to 2122. World War III will also pave the way to reset the monetary system of most nations back to an organic state, either through inflating away the mountains of debt or simply through bankruptcies, not to mention that most countries will also switch to a digital currency sometime during the 2030s. Notably, governments become emboldened to push through big agenda such as defaulting on debt and minting a new currency by leaps and bounds against the backdrop of a global conflict unfolding at their doorstep, and being comforted by the fact that there would be little or no public backlash against the new measures that would have otherwise been unthinkable in the antebellum era. Every deed is indeed not only kosher but also halal during times of war. Outside government agendas, the apocalyptic fear combined with the humongous cost of human life will serve as a wake-up call for hoi polloi to come to their senses, learn to live within their means once again, and begin to exercise humility once more at the expense of self-indulgence. And so will marriage and family become the toast of the town once again as they rightfully reclaim their primal place at the front and center of human society as the current Aquanium bids farewell and the curtain is raised over a new one in about a decade or so.